He read the date in the shop window twice. September 1937. Not a single car, not a single electric streetlight, just gas lamps, scrawny horses, and patched up sacks. This isn't a dream. This wasn't the model he'd been building in the garage. This was a real city on the brink of a real war, where he'd been flung out of his wrecked car. And in his pocket lay an empty tin box that could conjure up anything from memory. Now let's rewind. The cold cobblestones struck Daniel Park in the back and knocked the wind out of his lungs. He opens his eyes. A strange gray sky. Rain stings his face like icy needles. He's lying in the middle of a narrow street between two rows of stone houses with tiled roofs. A cardboard box is getting wet nearby. His box. 3 new model tanks on a 1:35 scale. He remembers the highway at night. He remembers how his eyelids grew heavy. He remembers the blow and the darkness. And now he's lying here, alive, in jeans and an autumn jacket. A man in uniform looms over him. Daniel blinks and stares intently. A cap with a cockade in the shape of an oak leaf. A Prussian-style overcoat. A Mannlicher M95 rifle slung from his belt. His heart skips a beat and then beats again. He recognizes that uniform. He recognizes that cockade. He knows that rifle down to the last millimeter because he built a model of it himself 2 years ago. The Duchy of Halden, the 1930s. The gendarme blurts out something in German with a soft southern accent, and Daniel understands every word. The stranger asks who he is and why he's lying on the road. Daniel sits down. He looks at his hands, at the box, back at his hands, and he laughs quietly, for the first time in a very long time. If this is a dream, it's the best one of his life. And if it isn't a dream, then he's just fallen right into his own hobby. The gendarme doesn't appreciate the laughter. He places his hand on his holster and repeats the question louder. Daniel stands up. His legs feel like cotton. His head is spinning. He raises his hands and slowly says that he's a traveler, that he's lost his way, that he's not dangerous. The gendarme's gaze slides over him from head to toe. Jeans, sneakers, a synthetic jacket that hasn't even been invented in this world yet. An Asian face in a tiny European town where no one has ever seen a living Korean. He doesn't remove his hand from the holster. He orders him to follow him. Daniel picks up the box, presses it to his chest, and sets off. The streets are narrow and wet. The houses are crammed together. Smoke pours from the chimneys. Somewhere, a cart creaks. Not a single car. Not a single street light. Only gas lamps at the intersections. Daniel walks along, taking in the details. A pharmacy sign in Gothic script. A poster urging people to donate scrap metal for the army. A newspaper in a shop window. September 1937. He freezes and reads the date again. A gendarme pokes him in the back. Daniel moves on. He is taken to the commandant's office. Gray stone. The Halden coat of arms above the door. Inside, it smells of dampness and tobacco. At the desk sits the non-commissioned officer on duty, with a mustache and eyes red from lack of sleep. The gendarme reports that he picked up a suspicious foreigner on Kirchenstrasse, dressed strangely and without papers. The non-commissioned officer looks at Daniel, at the box, back at Daniel, and he sighs. The way a man sighs when he still has 4 hours left on his shift, but trouble has already struck. They make Daniel sit on a wooden bench. They don't take the box away, but set it on the floor nearby. He sits and listens. Unter twists the receiver of an old telephone. The line crackles. He explains to someone that they've detained an Eastern vagrant without papers and aren't sure what to do with him. Daniel closes his eyes and goes over everything he knows about Halden. A duchy the size of Luxembourg, neutral since 1871. sandwiched between the Continental Pact to the east and the Western Union to the west. An army of 12,000 men, 6 obsolete tanks, no air force, a meager industrial base, ruled by the von Halden dynasty. And here he frowns. If it's 1937 and the Duchess's father has already died, then she's on the throne. Anneliese von Halden, 22 years old. He opens his eyes. Outside the window, a cart laden with patched sacks creeps down the street. The horse is skinny, and it dawns on him. This isn't a game. This isn't a 1:35 scale model. This is a real city where real people live in real poverty on the brink of a real war. He reaches into his inside pocket. His fingers feel for something small and rectangular. He pulls out a tin box that once held mint candies. Green, worn. He definitely didn't put it in his pocket. He opens the lid. Empty. He closes it. And at that moment, something shifts inside him, as if someone had turned a key in a lock he didn't know existed. He closes his eyes and pictures a wrench in his mind. An ordinary 17mm open-end wrench. The very same one lying in his garage at home. He can see every scratch on it. He opens the box, and the wrench is lying inside. Steel, cold, heavy, real. Daniel picks it up, twists it, taps it against the bench. The sound is real. The metal is real. He hides the wrench in his pocket. His hands are shaking. Not from fear, from realization. For 3 days, he's been languishing at the Eldmark command post. Black bread and thin soup twice a day. The same corporal asks the same questions over and over. Who he is, where he's from, where he's going. Daniel repeats the same thing over and over. A traveler, lost his way, going wherever his eyes take him. They don't believe him, but they have nothing to accuse him of. He hasn't broken the law. He's just a stranger. On the 3rd day, everything changes. Through the thin wall, he hears the corporal shouting into the phone. Hospital, medicines. A truck that broke down on the road between Eldmark and Weidenfeld. The cargo holds sulfonamides for the evacuation hospital. Without them, the wounded will start dying from infection in 2 days. There's no other truck, no spare parts. The mechanic is in the capital, which is a 4-hour ride on horseback. Unter slams down the receiver and curses. Daniel jumps up and goes to the door. He asks to speak to the garrison commander. Unter looks at him like he's crazy. Daniel says he'll fix the problem with the truck. Unter asks how he even knows that. Daniel replies that the walls are thin. Unter curses again and walks away. An hour later, Captain Heinrich Rauch arrives, the garrison commander. Gray-haired, lean, over 60. A straight back and the heavy gaze of a man who has seen too much to believe in pretty words. He sits down across from Daniel and silently stares him down for half a minute. Then he asks what Daniel has to offer. Daniel asks if there's an empty, locked shed in town. The captain mentions the coach house near the old post office. Daniel asks for 5 minutes alone there. The captain raises an eyebrow. And then Daniel drops the bomb. In 5 minutes, you'll get a truck with a full tank and medical supplies in the back. The captain is silent for 10 seconds. He stands up. He says, "Let's go." They walk down the wet street. Daniel carries the box. The captain walks half a step ahead and never once looks back. The coach house is old. Stone walls, a wooden gate. It smells of hay and horses. The captain stops outside. Daniel goes in and closes the gate. He sets the box on the ground. He takes out the tin can. He closes his eyes and he remembers. An Opel Blitz, a 3-metric-ton army truck, a 6-cylinder engine with 68 horsepower, a payload capacity of just over 3 metric tons. He built this model 4 years ago. He remembers every rivet on the cab, the shape of the fenders, The spare tire, even the color, dark gray feld gray. He opens the box, and the world around him hums. Captain Rauch swings open the gate and sees the truck. New, in working order, a full tank, a first aid kit in the cab, 40 boxes of sulfonamides in the bed, labels in German, no date of manufacture. The captain walks around the vehicle. He touches the hood. He gets behind the wheel. He turns the key. The engine fires up on the first try. A smooth, powerful sound. The captain turns it off. He gets out. He looks at Daniel. And Daniel is holding onto the wall because his legs won't hold him up. His face is pale. He has dark circles under his eyes. He's shaking slightly. The captain steps right up close, and Daniel drops another bombshell. Your nephew in the hospital won't make it to Friday without these vials. The captain freezes. His face is stony. Only his jaw muscles twitch beneath his skin. He asks how Daniel knows about his nephew. Daniel says he overheard the sergeant's phone call this morning. The captain stands motionless for 5 seconds. Then he nods. Once. And utters a single word. Let's go. The truck reaches the hospital in Weidenfeld in 2 hours. The captain drives himself. Daniel fights off sleep in the cab. His body is wrung out like a rag. Every muscle aches. His head is splitting. But he doesn't sleep. He looks at the wet fields and bare trees and thinks. The Opel Blitz won't go into production for another 2 years. Or maybe it never will, because this is a different world. Similar, but different. And in 40 days, 3 armies will come here and crush everything he sees out the window. Fields, trees, houses, people. The captain remains silent the whole way. Only when they reach the hospital does he slow down and turn around. His eyes are dry and hard. He says he doesn't understand who Daniel is or where he got this truck. That he's 63 and has seen enough in war to tell a miracle from a trick. And that this isn't a trick. He adds that his nephew Marcus is 17, a shrapnel wound in his thigh. Sepsis, 3 days without sulfonamides. The captain leaves and heads for the hospital. Halfway there, he turns around and says that Daniel can spend the night at his place, that there's a spare room, and that they'll talk tomorrow. Daniel slept for 18 hours. When he opened his eyes, it was morning on the 4th day outside the window. The room was small and clean. A wooden bed, a wardrobe, a table, a chair. On the table stood a mug of cold tea and lay a slice of black bread. Daniel sat up in bed and tried to stand. His legs supported him, but only weakly. His head no longer ached. The shivering had stopped. He ate the bread and drank the cold tea. Then he got dressed and left the room. Captain Rauch's house was a 2-story old building. The wooden stairs creaked under his feet. The smell of coffee filled the first floor. Real coffee, not the instant powder Daniel had grown accustomed to in his past life, but thick, black coffee, brewed in a copper chesve. Captain Rauch was sitting at the kitchen table. A map lay in front of him, a large one, worn, with pencil markings. He looked at Daniel and nodded toward a chair. Daniel sat down. Rauch poured him some coffee. They were silent. Outside the window, someone was chopping wood. The steady thud of an axe. Rauch finally spoke. He said that Marcus was alive, that they'd given him sulfonamide that night, that his fever had started to subside by morning, that the doctor said the boy would walk again. Rauch paused for a second. Then he said he wanted to know the truth now. Daniel looked at the map on the table. He looked at Rauch and decided that this man deserved honesty. Not the whole truth, but enough. He said that he wasn't from here, that he was from another world, that he was an engineer, not a soldier, that he had the ability to obtain things that didn't exist here, that it cost him strength and health. that he wasn't a spy or an envoy from any of the three blocs. Rauch listened in silence. His expression didn't change. When Daniel finished, Rauch took a sip of coffee and asked only one thing. He asked why. Why had Daniel helped? Daniel said he didn't know. He said he saw people dying and that he could stop it. Rauch nodded. Apparently, that was a sufficient answer for a man of his generation. That same day, Rauch sat down at the phone and spoke with someone in the capital for 2 hours. Daniel didn't eavesdrop. He sat in the room and thought. 40 days until the ultimatum. 12,000 bayonets in Halden's forces. 6 obsolete tanks. Not a single airplane. Facing them were 3 armies, each of which outnumbered Halden's forces by a factor of 10. The math was simple and ruthless. Halden couldn't win in open combat. Even if Daniel pulled an entire tank division out of the box, he'd be out of commission for a month, and the tanks would run out of fuel in a week. This wasn't a game. There's no restart button here. There are no infinite resources here. Here, there's just him. One box and his knowledge. He pulled the box out of his pocket and turned it over in his hands. Small, green, worn. An entire arsenal fit inside this box. But an arsenal is useless without people who know how to use it. Useless, useful, without gasoline, without ammunition, without repair shops, without roads to transport shells on. War isn't about tanks. War is about logistics. He knew that better than anyone else in the world. For 6 years, he had modeled supply chains for military strategies. He calculated how many rail cars were needed to transport a brigade, how many liters of diesel a tank company burns during a day's march, where to set up field hospitals, how to distribute ammunition among battalions. He knew all this in numbers, in tables, in percentages of losses. Now he had to apply all of this to the real world, to muddy roads, to hungry soldiers, to worn-out rifles. By evening, Rauch walked into the room and said that a car from the capital would come for Daniel tomorrow morning. They wanted to see him in Haldenberg. Daniel asked who. Rauch said he'd spoken with Colonel von Eisenberg, the chief of staff of the Duchy's armed forces. He'd told him about the truck. Not everything, just that a man had appeared who could help with the supply problem. Von Eisenberg demanded that this man be brought to him immediately. Daniel asked which von Eisenberg. Rauch described him. 61 years old, a career military officer. He served Halden since he was 18. He lost his left eye at Grossenheim in 1918. He wears a black eye patch, straight as a bayonet and stubborn as a mule. He hates foreigners. He doesn't trust anyone who isn't in uniform. Daniel nodded. He'd expected something like this. Every strategy game had a character like that, an old general who didn't trust a rookie. Only this wasn't a game, and von Eisenberg wasn't a character. He was a living person who had shouldered the army of a doomed state for 20 years and had every right not to trust a stranger in strange clothes. On the morning of the 5th day, a car pulled up to Rauch's house, an old black Horch, worn but well-maintained. At the wheel sat a young lieutenant in a Halden uniform. Daniel said goodbye to Rauch. The captain shook his hand, firmly. He didn't say a word. He just nodded. Daniel got into the car and drove for 4 hours along the narrow roads of the duchy. The roads were in poor condition, gravel and mud. In some places, there were potholes deep enough for the car to sink up to the hub. The bridges were wooden and narrow. Twice, they stopped at checkpoints. Young soldiers with weary faces checked their documents. Daniel had no documents. Each time, the lieutenant showed a stamped piece of paper, and they drove on. Daniel looked out the window. The fields had been harvested, but were empty. The villages were small. The houses were made of stone. The people on the streets were mostly women and old people. The children were dressed in hand-me-downs from their elders. They were thin, serious, unchildlike in their seriousness. Once, Daniel saw a girl of about 10 carrying a bundle of firewood on her back that was bigger than she was. He turned away from the window and closed his eyes. Haldenberg came into view around a bend in the mountain road, a small town on a hill, fortress walls, a castle with 3 towers, tiled roofs, the spire of the cathedral, a river at the foot of the hill, a bridge across the river. The town was beautiful, with that weary beauty that comes from having endured too much. The car drove through the gate and up the cobblestone street toward the castle. At the castle gate stood 2 sentries. The lieutenant stopped the car. Daniel got out. The air was cold and clear. It smelled of smoke and pine needles. He was led across the courtyard, past the stables and barracks, into the headquarters building. A long corridor, a stone floor, portraits of former dukes on the walls, oil lamps, the smell of old paper and gun oil. The lieutenant stopped in front of the office door and knocked. A voice from inside said, "Come in." Daniel entered. Colonel von Eisenberg was sitting at a massive oak desk. He wore a black eye patch over his left eye. His temples were silvered. His uniform was immaculate. His back was straight. His one good eye looked at Daniel the way a surgeon looks at a suspicious tumor. The colonel did not stand up. He did not offer his hand. He didn't offer him a seat. He just stared. 30 seconds. A minute. Daniel stood there and waited. The colonel finally spoke. He said that Captain Rauch was a man he trusted unconditionally. He said that Rauch claimed Daniel could solve the army's supply problem. Then he fell silent and waited for a response. Daniel said he could help, but not solve it, because Halden's problem wasn't with supplies. The problem was that Halden was preparing for a war that couldn't be won by conventional means. Colonel von Eisenberg narrowed his one eye. He asked what Daniel meant by unconventional means. Daniel said he needed 2 weeks and access to the arsenal. The colonel said no. Daniel said that in that case, in 40 days, he would be standing in this very spot, watching as enemy soldiers took down the portraits of the Halden dukes from the walls. The colonel stood up. His single eye burned with a cold fire. He said that a kid in plain clothes wouldn't tell him how to defend the country to which he had dedicated his life. Daniel didn't back down. He said he wasn't ordering him. He was asking. 2 weeks. If, after that, the colonel decided Daniel was useless, he would leave on his own. The colonel was silent. Then he sat down, and he said one word. 1 week. First thing, Daniel asked to be shown around the armory. Von Eisenberg sent a young aide, Lieutenant Weber, with him. 24 years old, thin, polite. He looked at Daniel with poorly concealed curiosity. The armory was located in the castle's basements and in 2 warehouse buildings by the river. Daniel walked through them for 6 hours, without a break. He handled every rifle, opened every box. He counted the rounds. He checked the bolts. He sniffed the oil in which the barrels had been preserved. He wrote everything down in the notebook Weber had given him. The situation was worse than he'd expected. 12,000 bayonets on paper translated to 8,000 combat-ready soldiers. The rest were sick, untrained reservists, or existed only on paper. The Mannlicher M95 rifles were old but serviceable. There were enough rounds for 4 days of active combat. 6 tanks were parked in a hangar by the river. Daniel inspected each one. 2 were in acceptable condition. 2 required major repairs. 2 were scrap metal. The artillery consisted of 24 75mm field guns. Half had no sights. Enough shells for 2 days of fighting. Transport. 14 trucks, 9 of which were roadworthy. 120 horses, 30 wagons. Communications. 6 field telephones, 2 radio receivers. Not a single radio transmitter. By evening, Daniel returned to von Eisenberg's office. He placed a notebook filled with numbers on the table. The colonel read in silence. His expression didn't change. He knew these numbers better than Daniel did. He had lived with them every day for the past 20 years. When he finished reading, he closed the notebook and asked, "So, what's next?" Daniel said he would start small, with what could be done without magic. All the rifles needed to be inspected, zeroed in, lubricated, worn-out springs replaced. Shooting drills needed to be organized. The soldiers must shoot every day. We need to repair the 2 tanks that can be repaired. We need to set up field communications. The colonel said he had no springs for the rifles, no spare parts for the tanks, no wire for the telephone lines. There's no money to buy any of this. Daniel said he would take care of it. The colonel gave him a long, heavy look and said nothing. For the next 5 days, Daniel worked 18 hours a day. Every morning, he would go to the empty carriage house next to the castle stables and take out of a box whatever was needed for that day. A box of rifle springs, a set of tools for repairing tanks, reels of telephone wire. Each time afterward, he would sit on the floor for 20 minutes and wait for the dizziness to pass. Small items took less effort than a truck, but his strength was still draining away. By the 3rd day, he had started coughing. By the 5th day, the shadows under his eyes were so deep that Lieutenant Weber asked if he was sick. Daniel said he was just tired. That was the truth. He wasn't lying. He just wasn't telling the whole truth. Between visits to the carriage house, Daniel worked with the men. He found 4 soldiers from the garrison who knew something about mechanics. He put them to work repairing tanks. He showed them how to properly adjust valve clearances, how to replace track pins, how to tune a carburetor. The soldiers looked at him in bewilderment. This civilian in strange clothes knew more about tanks than all the officers put together. He knew the part numbers. He knew the tolerances in millimeters. He knew the weak spots of every vehicle. When one of the mechanics asked how he knew all this, Daniel said he'd read a lot. That was true too. On the 6th day, Daniel saw the Duchess for the first time. He was standing knee-deep in an inspection pit beneath the tank's undercarriage, explaining to a mechanic how to properly tighten the bolts, when footsteps and voices were heard from above. Someone said, "Your Highness." Daniel climbed out of the pit. His hands were covered in oil up to his elbows. A streak of dirt ran across his forehead. His jacket was torn at the shoulder. Standing before him was a young woman in a dark blue uniform. The uniform was slightly too big for her in the shoulders. Her ash blonde hair was pulled back into a neat bun. Her face was pale and calm. Her eyes were gray. She looked at him expressionlessly. Standing next to her was Colonel von Eisenberg, his face as stony as a rock. Anneliese von Halden, the ruling duchess, 22 years old, heiress following the deaths of her father and both brothers. The woman on whose shoulders all of this rested, this entire city, all these people, all these 12,000 soldiers. And in 34 days, she was to sign the surrender. Daniel wiped his hands on his pant legs. It didn't help. He looked at his oil-blackened palms and realized that bowing or shaking hands would be inappropriate. He simply nodded and said, "Good afternoon, Your Highness." The Duchess looked at him, at his hands, at the tank behind him, at the mechanic standing at attention. She asked what he was doing. Daniel said he was repairing the tank. She asked why. Daniel said that a broken tank is just scrap metal, but a working tank is a force to be reckoned with. She didn't smile. She nodded and walked away. Von Eisenberg lingered. He looked at Daniel, at the tank, at the mechanics. Then he said quietly that the Duchess wanted to see him tomorrow morning, officially, in the throne room. Daniel asked if he needed to wear his uniform. Von Eisenberg looked at his jeans and torn jacket and, for the first time since they'd met, let out a sound that might have been a short chuckle. He said he'd get Daniel something presentable. On the morning of the 7th day, Daniel stood in the throne room of Haldenberg Castle. He was wearing a dark suit, not a uniform. He'd insisted on it. Civilian clothes. He was in civilian clothes and intended to stay that way. The suit didn't belong to him and didn't fit well. The sleeves were too long and the shoulders too narrow. But it was better than jeans. The throne room wasn't majestic. Rather, it was simply large and old. Stone walls, tall windows, banners on the walls, worn, faded. A long table in the center. 4 people sat at the table. Duchess Anneliese presided. Colonel von Eisenberg to her right. To her left, the Minister of Finance, Baron von Kleist, elderly, tired. Next to him, the Chief of Police, Oberkommissar Langer, heavyset, wary. The Duchess invited Daniel to sit down. He sat across from her. She said that Colonel von Eisenberg had reported to her on the results of his work over the past week, that 2 tanks had been restored to combat readiness, that daily firing exercises had been organized, that telephone communication between the garrisons had been established. She said she was impressed. Then she said she wanted to know what he could offer Halden. Daniel was silent for 10 seconds. Everyone was looking at him. Then he said he couldn't give Halden an army. He couldn't give victory. He couldn't give security. He could give time and a chance. The Duchess asked what that meant exactly. Daniel asked for a map. Lieutenant Weber unfolded that very same map from von Eisenberg's office on the table. Daniel stood up and began to speak. He spoke for an hour, without stopping. He spoke about logistics, about supply lines, about how an army that cannot feed itself cannot fight, about how each of the 3 blocks had stretched its supply lines to the limit, about how the Continental Pact transported ammunition via a single railroad line that could be cut off with a single precise strike, about how the Western Union depended on maritime shipments that passed through 3 ports, about that the Pacific Sphere supplies its expeditionary force with caravans traveling halfway across the continent. He spoke of how Halden did not need to defeat 3 armies. He needed to become such an inconvenient target that the cost of defeating him would outweigh the benefit. A hedgehog. A small, prickly hedgehog that's cheaper to go around than to eat. When he finished, the room was silent. Baron von Kleist took off his glasses and wiped them with a handkerchief. Oberkommissar Langer was looking at the map. Von Eisenberg sat motionless. Duchess Anneliese looked at Daniel. For a long time. Then she said she was giving him not 1 week, but 2, and access to everything he needed. Daniel spent the first 3 days of the allotted 2 weeks on what any normal person would consider tedious paperwork. He made lists. Lists of what was available, lists of what was needed, lists of what he could get from the box, and lists of what the box wouldn't solve. The last list was the longest. Food. The box couldn't feed 12,000 soldiers. Coal. The box couldn't heat the city. Horses. The box couldn't create living creatures. Or maybe it could, but Daniel didn't know any specific horse well enough to try. He sat poring over the lists in the small office he'd been assigned at headquarters. The office was a former storage room. No windows, 1 desk, 1 chair, a kerosene lamp. He worked by the light of that lamp until late at night and fell asleep right at his desk. In the morning, Lieutenant Weber would wake him up. Silently, he'd set a mug of coffee on the desk and leave. Daniel started over. On the 4th day, he went to von Eisenberg with a finished plan. The colonel was sitting at his desk reading reports. He didn't look up when Daniel entered. Daniel placed 3 sheets of paper covered in fine handwriting in front of him. Von Eisenberg finished reading the report. He set it aside. He picked up Daniel's sheets of paper. He read for 15 minutes. Then he placed the sheets on the desk and, for the first time ever, looked at Daniel not as a suspicious outsider, but as a man who had said something worthwhile. The plan was simple. Halden could not field an army capable of fighting in open terrain. That meant open combat had to be avoided. Instead, Daniel proposed creating a system of fortified defensive nodes along key routes: 3 mountain passes, 2 bridges across the Schwarz River, the railroad junction at Weidenfeld. Each strongpoint must be capable of holding out autonomously for at least 3 days without resupply. This requires fortified positions, minefields, anti-tank barriers, supplies of food and ammunition at each strongpoint, and most importantly, communication. Each junction must have radio contact with headquarters and with neighboring junctions. Without communication, the defense falls apart into separate garrisons that are overwhelmed one by one. With communication, it is a single, unified entity capable of maneuvering its reserves. Von Eisenberg read the plan. Then he read it again. Then he put it on the table and said the plan was good, but unworkable. Because Halden had neither radios, nor mines, nor anti-tank weapons, nor concrete for fortifications. Daniel said he'd get the radios, the mines too, the anti-tank rifles as well. And concrete wasn't needed. What was needed was earth and logs. Earthen fortifications with wooden decking can withstand anything except a direct hit from a heavy shell. And none of the 3 blocks in this area has heavy artillery. It's too far from their supply bases. Von Eisenberg asked where Daniel would get the radios. Daniel said that was his business. Von Eisenberg asked how many he could provide. Daniel said 12 field radios. The American SCR 300 model, range 5 kilometers, weight 17 kilograms. 1 person can carry it on their back. Von Eisenberg had never heard of that model. He asked when. Daniel said he'd start tomorrow, 2 a day, 6 days. Von Eisenberg asked what the price was. Daniel said the price was his health. That was all the colonel needed to know. Von Eisenberg was silent. Then he nodded. The next 6 days were the worst of Daniel's life. Every morning he went into the carriage house. He closed his eyes and took 2 SCR 300 radios out of the box. He knew that model by heart. He had built it on a 1:6 scale for a diorama of the Normandy landings. He remembered the pull of every switch, every tube, every contact. The radios came out perfect, fully functional, tuned, with a full set of batteries. But every time after that, Daniel would lie on the floor of the shed for 20 minutes, unable to get up. By the 3rd day, he had a nosebleed. By the 5th, he began to lose consciousness for a few seconds. Lieutenant Weber, who was standing guard at the barn gate, and whom Daniel had strictly forbidden from entering, heard Daniel fall. Every time, he knocked on the gate and asked if everything was all right. Every time, Daniel said yes. Every time, he was lying. On the 6th day, he took out the last 2 radios and walked out of the barn as white as a sheet. He took 3 steps and collapsed. Weber caught him. Daniel said he needed to sleep. Weber carried him to his room. Daniel slept for 14 hours. When he woke up, there was a bowl of broth on his table. Next to it was a note in neat feminine handwriting. The note contained 3 words: eat and get well. There was no signature, but Daniel later learned from Weber that the Duchess had brought the broth herself. She had come. She asked Weber what was going on. Weber said that Mr. Park had fainted from exhaustion. The Duchess ordered the broth to be brought from the kitchen, and then she carried it herself to Daniel's room. Weber said this with the kind of expression people have when they talk about things they don't understand but consider important. Daniel drank the broth. He got up and went to work, because 12 radio stations without people who know how to use them are just boxes full of tubes. He found 6 soldiers with good hearing and sat them down to learn Morse code, communication procedures, tuning frequencies, replacing batteries. 6 hours a day, every day. A week later, he had 6 radio operators. Not perfect, but capable of sending and receiving messages. At the same time, Daniel worked with the sappers. Halden had 20 sappers. 20 for the entire army. Daniel took 2 crates of anti-personnel mines and 1 crate of anti-tank mines out of the box, and the installation manual. And he spent 2 days at the training range personally demonstrating how to set them and how to remove them. He wasn't a sapper. He had never held a real mine in his hands in his life. But he had built 14 1-72 scale models of minefields and knew the theory better than most officers in this army. On the 12th day of the allotted 14, von Eisenberg arrived at the training ground. He stood silently for an hour, watching as an infantry platoon practiced defending a fortified position. He watched as the radio operator, with an SCR-300 slung over his back, relayed the coordinates of the simulated enemy. He watched as the sappers laid out a minefield according to the diagram Daniel had sketched on a napkin at breakfast. When the exercises were over, von Eisenberg approached Daniel. He took off his glove. He held out his hand. Daniel shook it. The colonel's hand was dry and stiff as a board. Von Eisenberg said that if they had explained logistics to him at the military academy the way Daniel did, he would have risen to the rank of field marshal. Then he turned and walked away. It was the closest thing to praise Daniel had ever heard from him. On the 13th day, Daniel requested an audience with the Duchess. He needed more. The 2 weeks were coming to an end. He had shown results. Now it was time to talk about things that couldn't be taken out of a box. The Duchess received him in her study, not in the throne room. The study was small, cozy, with a fireplace. On the walls were maps and photographs. In one photograph, a young man in uniform was holding a little girl in his arms, father and daughter. Daniel looked at the photograph and looked away. The Duchess sat at the table and looked at him, patiently, impassively. Daniel said he needed people, not soldiers, workers, engineers, builders. He needed 3,000 people to build the fortifications. He needed women for the factories because the men would be sent to the front lines. He needed access to the railroad. He needed food for the work crews. He needed permission to requisition private vehicles. He couldn't get any of this from a box. Only a living ruler of a living country could provide it. The Duchess listened. Then she asked one thing. She asked if he himself believed it would work. Daniel was silent for 5 seconds. Then he said he didn't know. He said the odds weren't good. He said he'd never actually done anything like this before, that everything he knew came from books, models, and calculations, that he might be wrong. The Duchess nodded. She said that honesty in his position was either bravery or foolishness, and that she'd decided to count it as bravery. She signed the orders. All of them. Every single one. And she said that starting tomorrow, he would receive official status as an advisor to the Halden Duchy's defense staff. No rank, no uniform, but with the authority to issue orders on her behalf. The 25th day. 25 days in this world. 15 days until the ultimatum. Daniel stood on a hill above the Schwarz River and looked at the Schwarzbrück Bridge. Stone. Old. 3 arches. The only crossing over the river for 50 kilometers in either direction. If the Continental Pact launches an offensive from the east, it will cross this bridge. There are no other options. The mountains to the north are impassable for military vehicles. To the south lie swamps. Only the bridge. And Daniel looked at that bridge and realized that Halden's fate would be decided here. Von Eisenberg stood nearby, silently, looking at the same thing. They both knew. The wind from the river was cold. It was mid-October. The leaves on the trees had already turned yellow. The first frost had struck 3 days ago. Winter comes early in the mountains. Von Eisenberg said that, according to intelligence reports, the Continental Pact was concentrating its forces near the border. 2 infantry divisions, 1 tank regiment, an artillery brigade, a total of about 30,000 men, against Halden's 8,000 combat-ready soldiers, a ratio of nearly 4-1. Von Eisenberg spoke these figures in the even tone of a man long accustomed to counting losses before the battle even began. Daniel nodded. He knew those numbers. And he knew that the time had come to do what he'd feared from day one. Take out of the box not objects, but people. He returned to Haldenberg. He asked Weber to find him the largest closed hangar in the city. Weber found an old beer warehouse on the outskirts. Stone walls, high ceilings. The gates were wide enough for a truck to drive through. Daniel went inside alone. He closed the gates. He sat down on an upside-down barrel. He took out the box. And for the first time, he thought not about what to take out, but about whom. People. Living people. Not 1:35 scale models. Not figures on a game board. Real people with names and faces and lives. If he pulled them out, they'd be here, in this world, forever. He didn't know where they'd come from. He didn't know what would happen to them in the world they were coming from. He didn't know if they would vanish from there or be copied. He knew nothing except that they would appear here, alive and real, and would regard him as the one who brought them here. His hands were shaking. He closed his eyes and began to think. He needed a tank company, not just tanks, crews, trained crews who knew their vehicles. He knew of such a company. The 3rd Company of the 2nd Tank Regiment of the Red Army, T-34-76s, model year 1942, built at plant number 183 in Nizhny Tagil. He had built a diorama of this unit a year ago, 14 tanks, 56 crew members. He remembered the names of the tank commanders from the book he'd used as a source. Senior Lieutenant Kovalev, Lieutenant Samoylov, Junior Lieutenant Petrenko. Real people who had fought in a real war. He opened the box. The world exploded in white light. Pain shot through his body like an electric shock. Daniel fell from the barrel onto the stone floor. Black spots swam before his eyes. A ringing filled his ears. He didn't know how long he'd been lying there. A minute? 10? When he was able to turn his head, he saw them. 2 T-34 tanks stood in the hangar, gray-green, with red stars on their turrets. People were standing next to the tanks. 8 of them. 2 crews, wearing tank helmets and coveralls. They were looking around. One of them was holding a pistol. Another was on all fours, vomiting. Daniel tried to stand up. He couldn't. He tried again. He got up onto his knees. The man with the pistol turned toward him and shouted something in Russian. Daniel didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. "Who are you? Where are we? What's going on?" Daniel raised his hands, slowly, palms open, facing forward. And in German, he said they were safe, that he would explain, that he needed time. The man with the gun didn't understand German, but Daniel saw his face, young, 22 or 23, frightened and furious. This wasn't a character. This was a living person who had just been torn from his life and thrown into a foreign world. Daniel looked him in the eyes and realized what he had done. He felt sick. Not from exhaustion, from the realization. He closed his eyes and lost consciousness. He came to in his room in the castle. It was dark outside the window. Weber was sitting on a chair nearby. Daniel asked what time it was. Weber said a day had passed. Daniel asked what had happened to the men from the hangar. Weber fell silent. Then he said that Colonel von Eisenberg had taken care of it. The tank crew had been detained and fed. They'd been placed in the barracks. Their pistols had been taken away. An interpreter from headquarters had spoken with them, an old Russian teacher who used to work in the archives. The tank crew members were in shock, but not aggressive. They claimed that just a minute ago, they'd been on the march near the city of Voronezh. Summer, heat, dust. And then a blinding light, and they were here, in some kind of stone shed. Winter. Cold. A different country. Daniel listened and felt something heavy and cold tightening inside him. These people were real. They had been there. They had fought. They had lived. And he had torn them away from there, simply because he needed tanks. He sat down on the bed. His head was spinning. His body ached. But he forced himself to stand up. He told Weber that he needed to go to the tank crew. Weber said the colonel had ordered him to stay in bed. Daniel said the colonel hadn't seen their faces. Weber looked at him and didn't say a word. Daniel made it to the barracks. 8 tank crewmen were sitting in the room. They'd been given food and blankets. They were silent. When Daniel walked in, the man with the pistol stood up. He was half a head taller than Daniel, broad-shouldered, high cheekboned, tanned. There was a brown stain on the chest of his jumpsuit. Someone else's blood or his own? He was looking at Daniel. Daniel said through the interpreter that his name was Daniel Park, that he was to blame for what had happened to them, that he didn't know how to get them back, that he would do everything to keep them safe, and that he understood if they hated him. The interpreter translated. The tank crewman remained silent for a long time. Then he asked one thing. He asked what year it was. The interpreter said 1937. The tank driver blinked. Then he sat back down on the bunk and said nothing more. Daniel stood in the doorway of the barracks and looked at the 8 people he had stolen from their lives. He memorized every face, every single one, and he promised himself he would remember them for the rest of his life, no matter how long that life might be in this world. Over the next 3 days, Daniel did it twice more. Each time was worse than the last. Second company, 4 more tanks, 16 more men. Third company, 4 more tanks, 16 more, plus a motorized infantry battalion, 320 men, on SDKFZ 251 half-track transporters that he knew down to the last bolt. Each time afterward, Daniel was completely wiped out. After the second call, his temperature rose to 39. After the third, he raved for 2 days. A doctor from the hospital would come by and shake his head. He said the patient was completely exhausted, that he needed rest, food, peace, and quiet. Von Eisenberg would stand in the doorway and silently watch Daniel. Then he'd leave. The Duchess came every evening. She set a bowl of broth on the table. She stood there for a minute. Then she left. Not a word. On the 5th day, the fever broke. Daniel opened his eyes. Dawn was breaking outside the window. His 30th day in this world. 10 days until the ultimatum. Halden now had 10 T-34 tanks and 360 trained soldiers who weren't supposed to be here, plus 6 local tanks, 4 of which were operational, plus 12 radio stations, plus fortified positions at 3 mountain passes and at the Schwarzbrück Bridge, plus 8,000 of Halden's soldiers who had fired more shots in the last month than in the entire previous year. It wasn't enough. Daniel knew it. Von Eisenberg knew it. The Duchess knew it. But it was better than nothing, and it was all they had. Daniel got out of bed. He got dressed. He left the room. He went down the stairs. He walked across the courtyard. He entered the barracks. 360 men, Russian tank crews, German motorized infantrymen, all from another world, all lost, all frightened, but alive. Daniel asked that everyone be gathered. They assembled in the barracks courtyard. They stood in groups, the Russians apart, the Germans apart. Between them, the silent tension of people who, not long ago, had been shooting at each other. Daniel stepped out in front of them, small, thin, pale from illness, in a civilian suit that hung on him like a coat hanger. He looked at them, at each one. Then he spoke. An interpreter stood nearby and translated for the Russians. Daniel said he knew they hadn't asked to be here, that he knew they had lost their homes, families, and comrades, that he knew some of them hated him for it. He said they had every right to feel that way. Then he said that in 10 days, the army would arrive here and destroy this city and the people in it, women, children, the elderly. The very same people they had defended in their own worlds, only with different names and speaking a different language. He said he wasn't ordering them to fight. He had no right to give such an order, but he was asking them to help protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And he promised that afterward, each of them would receive a home, land, and a job, and would live as a free person, not as a soldier, as a human being. The courtyard was silent. Then Senior Lieutenant Kovalev spoke up, the very same one, the one with the pistol, high cheekboned, tanned. He stepped forward. He looked at Daniel. Then he turned to his men. He said one sentence in Russian. The interpreter translated. He said that he was used to fighting the fascists and that the location didn't matter. The Russian tankers gave a grim smile. The German motorized infantrymen remained silent. But a minute later, their field sergeant also stepped forward and nodded, briefly, in a military manner. 10 days, 10 T-34 tanks, 4 local tanks, 360 men from another world, 8,000 Halden soldiers, 6 fortified defensive positions, 12 radio stations, minefields on the approaches to the bridge, 1 logistics engineer from Los Angeles with an empty tin box in his pocket, against 30,000. Daniel stood on a hill above the Schwarzbrück Bridge and looked east. That's where they'll come from. The wind was cold. The sky was gray. He clenched the tin in his pocket and began to count. Day 31. 9 days until the ultimatum. Daniel sat in headquarters over a map, placing tokens. Not real tokens. Buttons, shell casings, coins, whatever he could find on the table. The red ones were the Continental Pact, brass shell casings, 30,000 men, 2 infantry divisions, a tank regiment, an artillery brigade. The blue ones were Halden. Coins, 8,000 local soldiers, 10 T-34s, 4 refurbished local tanks, 360 men from another world, a ratio of 3.5 to 1. On paper, it was a death sentence. But Daniel wasn't looking at the numbers. He was looking at the map. Mountains, a river, a forest, 1 bridge, 3 mountain passes, narrow roads. The terrain favored the defender. Every pass was a bottleneck. Every bend in the road was an ambush. Every ravine was a defensive position. He wasn't planning to win the battle. He was planning to make it so costly for the enemy that they would stop and come to the negotiating table. Von Eisenberg entered the headquarters and stood by the table. He silently surveyed the layout. Daniel showed him the plan. The main position at the Schwarzbrück Bridge. 2 T-34 tanks in caponiers on the west bank. Minefields on the approaches to the bridge from the east. Infantry trenches in 3 lines. Anti-tank rifles on the flanks. Reserves in the forest behind the hill. 8 tanks and motorized infantry. The objective of the reserve is not to engage immediately, but to strike when the enemy becomes bogged down on the bridge. Von Eisenberg listened. Then he pointed his finger at the map. The northern pass. He asked what would happen if the Pact didn't cross the bridge, but instead went around through the mountains. Daniel shook his head. He said that tanks wouldn't make it through the pass, only infantry. And infantry without tanks and artillery on a narrow mountain road is a sitting duck. 2 machine gun nests and 1 mortar battery would shut down the pass for a week. Von Eisenberg looked at him, and something resembling respect flashed in his one eye. The next 3 days were spent preparing positions near the bridge. Daniel was there every day. He wasn't in command. He wasn't an officer and had no intention to become one. He stood nearby and explained. Here's the tank caponier, 2 meters deep, 4 meters wide. A wooden deck on top with an earthen embankment. The tank backs in. The turret sticks out over the edge. It fires from cover. You can only hit it with a direct shot from a distance of less than 500 meters. And at 500 meters, the T-34 will hit first. The Halden soldiers were digging. Local women and elderly people were digging too. The Duchess had ordered the mobilization of the civilian population to build fortifications. 3,000 people came out with shovels and pickaxes. Daniel watched them and thought that these people were digging for their chance at life. Literally. The Russian tank crews worked separately. They were tinkering with the tanks, checking the engines, zeroing in their guns. Senior Lieutenant Kovalev pushed the crews for 10 hours a day. He was tough and demanding, and he swore so much that the interpreter blushed. But the tankers listened to him, because he was one of them, because he knew what he was doing, and because he too was afraid and didn't hide it. German motorized infantry, under the command of Feldwebel Brauner, had taken up positions in the forest behind the hill. Brauner was one of those non-commissioned officers who carry the weight of the army on their shoulders. 36 years old, short, stocky, with the face of a man who had already seen it all and was surprised by nothing. He had organized the camp in 4 hours. Trenches, camouflage, guard posts, and a field kitchen. Daniel approached him that evening and asked how things were going. Brauner looked at him and said things were fine. Then he paused and said his men wanted to know one thing. They'd been promised homes and land. Was that true, or was it just the usual talk? Daniel said it was true. Brauner nodded and asked nothing more. On the 35th day, something happened that Daniel hadn't expected. A delegation from the Pacific Sphere arrived in Haldenberg. A trade delegation. Officially. 3 people. 2 officials in European suits and a young woman. Daniel learned about her from Weber. Hana Seo, 19 years old, the daughter of a diplomat. Formerly a hostage of goodwill at the Halden court. Korean. Daniel froze when he heard that. Korean. The first person in this world who shared his blood. He saw her that very same day. Petite, with a very straight back, in a simple, dark dress. Her hair was tied back in a bun. Her face was calm and closed off, like a locked door. She was walking down the castle corridor, accompanied by a lady-in-waiting, and wasn't looking around. Daniel was standing by the wall, and she walked past him. For a second, her gaze swept over him, over his face. She slowed her pace, almost imperceptibly. Then, she turned away and continued on. She had noticed him. An Asian man in a European castle. Of course she had noticed him. Daniel decided to wait, not to approach her first, not to draw attention to himself. But that same evening, as he sat in his study working on his calculations, there was a knock at the door. Hana Seo walked in, alone, unaccompanied. She closed the door. She looked at him and said, "Hello," in Korean. Daniel dropped his pencil. The sound of his native language struck him in the chest like a fist. He hadn't heard Korean spoken in 35 days. It was more than he'd expected, much more. He replied in Korean. She sat down in the chair across from him, and they talked for 2 hours. She was smart, frighteningly smart. She read 3 newspapers a day in 3 languages. She knew the schedules of the Pacific Sphere's maritime convoys by heart. She knew the names of all the commanders of all 3 blocks. She knew their habits, weaknesses, and connections. She wasn't just a hostage. She was an analyst, a natural. And she was just as alone in that castle as he was. She asked who he was. Daniel told the truth, not all of it, but more than he'd ever told anyone except Rauch. She listened. Her expression didn't change. When he finished, she was silent for a minute. Then she said that in a week, her father would order her to spy on Daniel. She said it simply, without shame, as a matter of fact. Daniel looked at her and said he knew, and that he wanted to offer her another option. On the 36th day, Daniel drove Hana to an observation post on the eastern border. They stood on top of a hill and looked through binoculars at the Continental Pact's camp. Tents, smoke from field kitchens, a convoy of trucks on the road. Far away, 15 kilometers, but visible. Hana looked and counted, out loud, in Korean. 200 tents in the main camp, 20 people in each, 4,000 in the advance echelon. The trucks are moving in columns of 10, spaced half an hour apart. That means they're bringing in equipment. That means they're getting ready. Artillery positions on the southern slope of the hill. The barrels are pointed west, toward Halden. Daniel listened and nodded. He thinks he didn't notice. She saw not the equipment, but the patterns. Not the quantity, but the direction. She said the pact would strike across the bridge, but not right away. First, there would be a provocation, an incident at the border, then an ultimatum, then 2 days to respond, and only then the strike. This was the Pact's standard procedure. She had read about it in the reports her father left on the table, thinking his daughter wasn't interested in politics. Daniel looked at her. She was 19. She was a hostage in a foreign country, and she had just given him intelligence worth more than a platoon of scouts. He thanked her, in Korean. She didn't smile, but she nodded slightly, and that was enough. Day 37, 8 days until the ultimatum. Another woman had arrived in Haldenberg, Emily Bradshaw, 26 years old, journalist, Western Union, redhead, freckled, with a disarming smile and sharp gray eyes that never smiled. She arrived with press credentials from the Western Post and a suitcase that, in addition to clothes, contained a portable encryption notebook. Daniel had learned about her from von Eisenberg. The colonel had summoned him that morning and told him that a Western Union spy had arrived under the guise of a journalist. Daniel asked how he knew. Von Eisenberg let out something resembling a smile. He said that he had been involved in intelligence work for a small country for 20 years and could tell a journalist from an officer by the way a person enters a room. A journalist looks around the room. An officer looks for the exits. Daniel met Emily over lunch in the castle dining hall. She sat down next to him on her own. She introduced herself. She asked if she could ask a few questions for an article. Daniel said, of course. She asked about everything: his background, his work in Halden, the military preparations, about the Duchess. The questions were professional, precise. Every other one had a catch. Daniel answered flatly and monotonously. He talked about logistics, about fuel consumption rates, about methods for reinforcing earthworks. 20 minutes later, Emily started yawning. 30 minutes later, she tried a different tactic. She leaned in closer, smiled, said she was free that evening and would like to continue the conversation over dinner. Daniel said he'd be happy to, and that he'd actually been meaning to recalculate the production rates at the munitions plant and needed help with the math. Emily blinked, then she laughed, briefly and bitterly. She realized he'd seen right through her. And she realized that this strange Korean man in an ill-fitting suit wasn't the kind of person you could pull the wool over. On the 38th day, Daniel called a meeting at headquarters. Present were von Eisenberg, Captain Rauch, who had been summoned from Elbmark, and Senior Lieutenant Kovalev, via an interpreter, Sergeant Major Browner, Lieutenant Weber, and, for the first time, Duchess Anneliese herself. She sat at the head of the table and listened. Daniel unfolded a map and reported on the situation. The Continental Pact had concentrated its main forces on the border. The attack would come across the Schwarzbrück Bridge, presumably within 2 days after the ultimatum expired. Based on intelligence reports, Daniel assumed that the infantry would advance first, supported by light tanks. Heavy equipment would follow in the second echelon. Artillery would fire from the eastern bank at positions on the western bank. Halden's mission, to prevent a breakthrough across the bridge, to force the enemy to halt and suffer sufficient losses to make the commander reconsider the cost of this operation. Von Eisenberg nodded. Rauch nodded. Kovalev said through an interpreter that his tank crews were ready. Browner said his men were ready as well. The Duchess remained silent. When everyone had spoken, she asked how many men they would lose. The room fell silent. Daniel said he didn't know, that the plan was designed to minimize casualties, but that war isn't a matter of calculation, that people would die. The Duchess nodded. She stood up. She said she would be at the command post during the battle. Von Eisenberg began to object. She looked at him, and he fell silent. She left. Daniel watched her go. She was 22 years old, and in a week, she would be her soldiers' die. The 40th day, the ultimatum had expired at midnight. Nothing had happened. Daniel sat in headquarters and waited. Von Eisenberg sat beside him and waited as well. The radio operator at the table in the corner listened to the airwaves. Silence. 1 o'clock in the morning. Silence. The second hour. Silence. The third. At 4 in the morning, the radio operator raised his hand. An interception. Plain text on the Continental Pact's frequency. The message was brief. The advance units of the 2nd Infantry Division had received orders to move out. Direction, west. Target, the Schwarzbrück Bridge. Operation start time, 6 o'clock in the morning. Von Eisenberg stood up. He adjusted the bandage over his eye. He glanced at his watch. 2 hours to go. He issued his orders, calmly, clearly, like a man who had been waiting for this moment for 20 years. All units to their positions. Radio silence until first contact. Civilian population to take cover. Hospital on standby. Daniel left headquarters. The night was cold and clear. Stars, a rarity for this fall. He stood in the castle courtyard, looking up at the sky and thinking that in 2 hours, people would begin to die. People he had brought here. People who had lived here before him. People who were now standing in the trenches, checking their bolts, writing their last letters, and praying. He took a small box out of his pocket. He turned it over in his hands. He could have gotten something else, anything else. Another tank, 10 more soldiers, but his body couldn't take it anymore. He was already at his limit, and every new soldier meant yet another life stolen. He put the small box away. He walked to the car. Weber was waiting behind the wheel. They drove toward the bridge. The command post was located on a hill 2 kilometers from the bridge. It was a dugout with a double-layered log ceiling. The observation slit faced east. Through binoculars, he could see the bridge and the gently sloping eastern bank beyond it. Von Eisenberg and 2 of his staff officers were already in the dugout. A radio operator with an SCR 300 on his back, and the Duchess. She stood by the observation slit in her dark blue uniform. Her hands were behind her back. Her back was straight. Her face was impassive. Daniel stood beside her, silently. 5:30 a.m. Dawn was breaking. A gray streak in the east. Fog over the river. Silence. Birds. The distant barking of a dog. 5:45 a.m. Movement appeared on the eastern bank. Small figures on the road. Infantry. A long column. They were moving quickly, without stopping. Daniel counted. 1 battalion. About 600 men. Behind them, another column. And another. Vehicles. Rectangular silhouettes. Light tanks. 1, 2, 6, 8. Armored personnel carriers. Trucks carrying infantry. They were heading toward the bridge. Unhurriedly. Confidently, as if marching toward a goal they already considered theirs. Von Eisenberg stood with his binoculars. His face was stony. 5:55. The lead column reached the bridge, the advance platoon, 30 men. They marched in column formation, rifles slung on their backs. They didn't even expect resistance. Daniel felt the Duchess next to him clench her fists. 6 o'clock sharp. The advance platoon reached the middle of the bridge. The first explosion shattered the morning silence like a clap of thunder. A mine. An anti-personnel mine. Daniel himself had planted it at the western end of the bridge. The advance platoon scattered. Screams. Smoke. A second explosion. A third. A chain of mines went off one after another. The soldiers on the bridge were thrown about. Some ran forward, some ran back, some lay motionless. Then the machine guns opened fire. 2 heavy machine guns on the west bank. Von Eisenberg had personally set up their positions. Crossfire. The bridge was being raked along its entire length. Soldiers on the bridge were falling. Those on the east bank took cover. The column came to a halt. 1 minute. 2. 3. Someone on the other side began giving orders. Shouts. Whistles. The infantry formed a line and moved toward the bridge again, now at a run, hugging the parapets. The machine guns kept firing, but the infantry pressed on, through the minefield, through the fire, losing men, but they kept advancing. They were disciplined and brave, professional soldiers. Daniel looked through his binoculars and saw their faces. Young, serious, determined. They weren't enemies. They were soldiers following orders, just like those standing on this side of the river. 20 minutes later, the first packed soldiers crossed the bridge. They ran along the west bank and took cover behind rocks and bushes. More followed behind them, and more. The machine guns couldn't stop them all. There were too many. Von Eisenberg turned to Daniel, silently. Daniel nodded. Von Eisenberg gave the order over the radio. 1 word. Fire. The ground shook. The first T-34 opened fire from the caponier. A 76mm shell struck the stone parapet of the bridge, 3 meters from the lead packed light tank, which had just driven onto the bridge. Stone fragments flew everywhere. The packed tank came to a halt. Its turret began to turn. The T-34's second shot hit it head-on. The packed light tank burst into flames. Its armor was 30 millimeters thick. The T-34's shell had a penetration of 50 per kilometer. This was no duel. It was an execution. A second light tank attempted to drive around the burning one. A second T-34 from the second caponier struck it in the side. The bridge was blocked. 2 burning tanks blocked the passage. The packed infantry on the west bank found themselves cut off from reinforcements. Without tanks, without artillery, facing Halden's entrenched infantry armed with machine guns and minefields. Von Eisenberg issued a second order. The Halden infantry launched a counterattack, not toward the bridge, but against those who had already crossed. 800 Halden soldiers against approximately 300 packed soldiers on the west bank. The battle was short and fierce. 40 minutes. The packed soldiers fought desperately, but they were cut off, surrounded, and without support. By 7 o'clock in the morning, they began to surrender, one by one, in groups. They dropped their weapons and raised their hands. On the east bank, the packed command regrouped. An hour later, the artillery barrage began. Guns fired from the hills on the eastern bank. Shells rained down on Halden's positions. The ground shook. Trees snapped. One shell landed 20 meters from the command post. The Duchess did not move from her spot. She stood at the observation slit and watched. Daniel stood beside her and kept count. The intervals between volleys, the number of barrels, and the caliber based on the sound of the explosions. 6 batteries, approximately 24 barrels, 105mm caliber, a firing range of 10 kilometers. They were positioned behind the hills. Halden's tanks in the caponiers were protected. So were the infantry in the trenches and bunkers. There were casualties from the shelling, but they weren't critical. The pack's artillery couldn't destroy the positions. It could only suppress them temporarily. And Daniel knew that the shelling would be followed by a second attack. He was right. 2 hours later, the shelling stopped, and a second wave moved toward the bridge. This time, heavy tanks, medium-sized by this world's standards, with 50mm armor. They crossed the bridge in single file. The bridge was narrow, only one tank at a time. The burning wrecks of 2 light tanks had been pushed into the river by Pact sappers under fire. The bridge was cleared. The first heavy tank rolled onto the bridge. Kovalev fired first, from 800 meters. A hit on the turret. The Pact tank spun around and came to a halt. But it didn't catch fire. The 50mm armor held. Kovalev fired again, at the same side. The shell penetrated. The tank began to smoke. The crew started to climb out. The second heavy tank on the bridge returned fire. The shell struck the edge of the caponnier. Dirt and logs flew into the air. Kovalev was unharmed. The caponnier held. He fired a third time. A hit on the track of the second tank. The tank came to a stop. The bridge was blocked again. The battle continued until dark. The Pact launched 3 more attacks. Each time, the infantry was supported by tanks. Each time, the bridge became a trap, narrow, exposed to fire, and with minefields at the western exit. By nightfall, 5 Pact tanks were burning on and around the bridge. Bodies lay on the west bank. Halden lost 83 men killed, 240 wounded. One T-34 was hit in the engine compartment and was put out of action. The crew survived. According to Daniel's estimates, the Pact lost at least 600 men killed and wounded. 5 tanks, 2 armored personnel carriers. These were terrible figures, for both sides. But for the Pact, they were unacceptable. They had come to occupy the impoverished principality in a single day. They hadn't expected tanks, which couldn't possibly be here. They hadn't expected minefields. They hadn't expected radio communications that allowed the defenders to coordinate their fire. They had expected 12,000 starving soldiers with obsolete rifles. Instead, they got a meat grinder. At night, the shooting died down. Daniel stepped out of the dugout. His legs wouldn't hold him up. Not because of the bottle, but from exhaustion, from tension, and from the smell of gunpowder and burning metal that hung in the air. He sat down on the ground at the entrance to the dugout and stayed there for half an hour. Then, the Duchess came out and sat down beside him, in silence. They sat in the darkness and listened to the wounded screaming far across the river. The Duchess said quietly that she had never heard the wounded scream like that before. Daniel didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say in reply. The morning after the battle. Dawn was gray and cold. A mist mixed with smoke hung over the river. The remains of tanks were smoldering on the bridge. The water in the Schwarz River was brown. Daniel stood on the hill, looking at it all, and felt empty. Like a barrel from which everything had been poured out, down to the last drop. He hadn't slept for 30 hours, but his legs were buckling. His eyes were burning, but he couldn't leave. He couldn't go to sleep while down on the riverbank, medics were gathering the wounded, while the female nurses were bandaging those who could still be bandaged, while the field kitchen was smoking by the road. He walked down the hill, past the trenches, past the craters, past the abandoned weapons, past the bodies that hadn't been cleared away yet. He reached the field kitchen. The cook had been wounded in the arm by shrapnel and was stirring the soup with one hand. Daniel approached. He took off his jacket, that very one, from that other world, and tied an apron over his dirty shirt. Then he stood at the cauldron. He cooked until noon, goulash for 800 men, a large pot, potatoes, meat, onions, salt, water. He chopped, stirred, and stoked the fire for 4 hours straight. Soldiers came up. They held out their mess kits. He poured, for everyone. Russian tankers, German motorized infantrymen, soldiers from Halden. He asked each one their name. He nodded to each one. He looked each one in the eye. Kovalev approached with his crew. Their faces were black with gunpowder soot. Their eyes were red. Kovalev looked at Daniel in his apron, ladle in hand. He didn't say a word. He held out his mess tin. Daniel poured him some. Kovalev nodded and walked away. Browner came with his men. He stood in line like everyone else. He received his portion. He looked at Daniel. He said one word, "Danke," and he walked away. A young Halden soldier, about 17, approached. His hands were shaking. His mess tin clinked against his spoon. His first battle, his first casualties. Daniel filled his mess tin to the brim. Then he put a hand on the boy's shoulder, just for a second, and nodded. The boy walked away. 800 men, 800 mess tins, 800 names. Daniel tried to remember each one. He didn't remember them all, but he tried. Anneliese arrived at noon, without an entourage, in a simple traveling cloak. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at Daniel, at his apron, at the ladle, at the pot, at the line of soldiers, at his face. Exhausted, gray, with dark circles under his eyes, with a streak of dirt on his forehead. She stood there watching for 2 minutes. Daniel didn't see her. He was ladling soup for the next soldier. Then he turned to get some potatoes and noticed her. He froze for a second, nodded at her, and went back to the pot. She stood there for another minute. Then she turned and left. Weber later told Daniel that when the Duchess left the kitchen, she stopped around the corner and stood there for a minute, and that her eyes were wet. Daniel didn't say anything in response. Toward evening, the Pact requested a ceasefire, a temporary one, for 24 hours, to evacuate the wounded from the bridge. Von Eisenberg brought the telegram to headquarters and placed it in front of the Duchess. She signed her consent. For the next 24 hours, silence reigned. A strange, empty silence after a day of thunderous noise. Daniel made the most of those 24 hours, every minute of it. He gathered Kovalev, Brauner, and the lieutenants of the Halden army at headquarters. He analyzed the battle minute by minute, what had worked, what hadn't. The tank caponiers worked perfectly. The minefields slowed down the first attack. Radio communication allowed them to coordinate their fire. But the machine gun positions were detected after the very first exchange of fire and suppressed by artillery. 2 crews were killed. They need to change positions after every 50 rounds. Reserve positions, communication routes between them. Kovalev said through an interpreter that his tanks in the caponiers were invulnerable to the Pact's light tanks, but that heavy tanks could penetrate the frontal armor of the T-34's frontal armor from 500 meters. We need to keep our distance. We need backup caponiers to change positions. Daniel nodded. He knew that. In theory, he'd known it even before the battle. But theory and 3 hours under artillery fire are 2 different things. Brauner said his motorized infantry hadn't been used. 320 men had sat in reserve all day. That's a waste. Daniel said the reserve was needed in case of a breakthrough. Brauner said there hadn't been a breakthrough, and there wouldn't be one as long as the bridge stood. The bridge is a bottleneck. As long as it stands, the enemy can only send 1 tank at a time, and Kovalev can take out a single tank with 2 shots. Brauner suggested using the motorized infantry for raids on the east bank, at night, in small groups, reconnaissance, sabotage, destruction of supply depots and artillery positions. Von Eisenberg listened, silently. When Brauner finished, the colonel looked at him and said it was a good idea. Brauner nodded. For him, the colonel's praise meant just as much as a hot dinner. On the 3rd day after the battle, Daniel received an unexpected visitor, Emily Bradshaw. She walked into his office without knocking. She sat down in a chair. She crossed her legs. She took a flask out of her bag and took a sip. Whiskey. 8 in the morning. She said she'd sent a coded message to London yesterday, a report on the battle, a detailed one, with figures and analysis. Daniel asked why she was telling him this. Emily said it was because he knew anyway, and because she wanted to ask him one question. She asked where Halden had gotten the T-34 tanks. Daniel remained silent. Emily said she had seen T-34s in reports from the Eastern Front, a Russian vehicle, manufactured in Nizhny Tagil, plant number 183. They aren't sold or exported. No one has them except the Red Army. And here are 10 of them standing in caponiers on the riverbank in a poor European principality. And the crews speak Russian. She said that was impossible. Daniel said that nevertheless, they were here. Emily looked at him with a long, heavy gaze. Then she said that her superiors in London were very eager to know the answer to this question, and that they would apply pressure, a lot of it. Daniel said he understood, and that when the time came, he would tell her. Not everything, but enough. Emily finished her whiskey. She stood up. At the door, she turned around and said the battle had been impressive. Then she left. On the fourth day after the battle, a telegram arrived from General Drakenberg, commander of the Continental Pact's strike force on the Halden front. The text was short and terse. General Drakenberg proposed a meeting. Neutral territory, the bridge. Tomorrow at noon. 2 officers from each side, unarmed. Von Eisenberg read the telegram. He set it down on the table. He looked at Daniel, then at the Duchess. The Duchess said they would go. Von Eisenberg said it was dangerous. The Duchess said that war was dangerous too. Daniel said he would go with them. Von Eisenberg objected. He said that Daniel was a civilian and shouldn't be at the negotiations. The Duchess said that was exactly why he would go, because Drakenberg expected to see military officers, but he would see an engineer in a shabby suit, and that will tell him more than any words. At noon on the 5th day after the battle, Daniel stood on the Schwarzbrück Bridge. Beside him stood the Duchess in her uniform. Next to her was von Eisenberg, wearing an armband and decorations. 2 men were approaching from the east bank. General Drakenberg, tall, gray-haired, and upright. His uniform immaculate, despite 5 days in the field. Beside him was his aide-de-camp, a young major. They met in the middle of the bridge, at the very spot where the first mine had exploded 5 days earlier. The traces were still visible, potholes in the stone, dark stains on the railing. Drakenberg looked at the Duchess, bowed his head, then looked at von Eisenberg and nodded. Old soldiers, a single generation. Then he looked at Daniel. His gaze lingered. Daniel saw a question in his eyes. Who is this civilian? Where is he from? Why is he here? Drakenberg spoke. His voice was low and calm. He said he had not come with terms of surrender. He had come with a proposal, for 30 days. Both sides would remain in their current positions, an exchange of the wounded and prisoners of war, the opening of a humanitarian corridor for the civilian population. Von Eisenberg listened. The Duchess listened. Daniel listened. When Drakenberg finished, the Duchess asked what the price was. Drakenberg said there was no price. He said he was a professional soldier, that he had come here with orders to capture Halden within 2 days, that 5 days had passed and he had lost 600 men and 5 armored vehicles without advancing a single meter. He said that continuing the assault was possible, but the cost would be such that his own command would ask him whether a destitute principality was worth 2,000 lives. He said he preferred to resolve matters through negotiations when the enemy had proven it knew how to fight. The Duchess was silent for 10 seconds. Then she said she accepted the truce. Drakenberg nodded. He turned and walked away. His back was straight and his steps were steady. Daniel watched him go and thought that this man was more dangerous than any fanatic, because it was impossible not to agree with him. A 30-day truce. Daniel made the most of every single one of them. First, he drove to Elbmark to see Greta König, chief engineer at the machine shop, a widow, 34 years old, stout, broad-shouldered, with hands that were constantly stained with machine oil. She met him at the factory gates. She looked him up and down and, right from the threshold, said, "You." Not you, not Mr. Park, you. Daniel didn't object. The factory was in poor condition. 3 workshops. One was idle. The second was operating at half capacity. The third was used as a warehouse. 20 workers, half of whom were drinking. The equipment was outdated. There hadn't been any orders since last year. Greta led him through the workshops. She showed him the machines, calling each one by name as if they were old friends. Here's Gustav, the lathe, from 1911. It works, but the spindle has play. Here's Elsa, the milling machine. It hasn't had a milling cutter for 2 years. Here's Otto. The press, broken. No one can fix it. Daniel listened and took it all in. Then he sat down at the desk in her office. The office was small and cluttered with blueprints. The ashtray was full of cigarette butts. A photograph of her husband hung on the wall, young, smiling, in work overalls. Daniel placed the sheets of paper in front of her. Blueprints, not of weapons. Greta unfolded the first sheet. She looked at it. She looked up. She looked at Daniel, then back at the blueprint. It was a children's tricycle. A simple design, a steel frame, 3 wheels, handlebars, pedals. Greta asked what it was. Daniel said it was Halden's first peacetime product. He said that after the war, the country would need bicycles, not tanks, and that they now... Greta stared at the blueprint. Her lips trembled. She cursed, long and foul. Then she looked up, and her eyes were filled with tears. She said that for 7 years, no one had come to her with a blueprint for something that living people actually needed. Only weapons, only repairs, only patch upon patch. And here was a bicycle. Daniel said this was just the beginning, that he had more blueprints. A new type of kerosene lamp, hand-operated water pumps, plows made of alloy steel. Everything simple, everything necessary, everything that could be made on her machines. Greta wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She smeared oil across her face. And she said that if he thought she was going to cry every time he came with a blueprint, he was wrong. Daniel said he didn't think so. Greta asked, "When do we start?" It took 2 weeks to convert the factory. Daniel took a set of milling cutters for the milling machine out of a box. He took out some spare bearings. He took out the repair manual for the press. Every time it was small things. Every time half an hour of weakness afterward. But it was bearable. Greta worked like a woman possessed. She rallied the workers. She fired 2 who showed up drunk. She hired 4 women from town. 2 weeks later, the factory was up and running. Not at full capacity, but it was running. The first batch. Not bicycles, cartridges. 8x50 caliber rifle cartridges for Mannlicher rifles. Daniel took a single cartridge out of the box. He took it apart in front of Greta. The cartridge case, gunpowder, the bullet, the primer. He explained the process. The cartridge cases are stamped from brass strip. The bullets are cast. They couldn't produce the gunpowder themselves, but Daniel took 200 kilograms of smokeless powder out of a box and said it would be enough for the time being. Greta looked at the powder boxes that had appeared out of nowhere in the empty workshop and asked just one thing. She asked where he was getting it from. Daniel said from a magic box. Greta said she didn't believe in magic. Daniel said neither did he. Greta snorted and went to count the equipment. 3 weeks later, the factory was producing 1,000 rounds a day. Not much by the standards of a real arms manufacturer, but for Halden, it was a miracle. Von Eisenberg arrived at the factory. He stood in the workshop and watched as the women at the machines stamped out cartridge cases. His face was impassive, but Daniel saw his hand tremble slightly as he picked up a finished cartridge and turned it over in his fingers. For 20 years, this man had counted every single cartridge. Literally. Every single one. Because there was nowhere to get new ones. And now, here they were. 1,000 a day. From a brewery converted into a weapons workshop. The colonel looked at Daniel. He didn't say a word. He just saluted, briefly, in military fashion, and left. Daniel realized that this was the highest praise von Eisenberg could bestow on a civilian. Alongside the factory, Daniel was working on the hospital, or rather, what was supposed to become a hospital. There was one doctor in Haldenberg, an old man with trembling hands, and one nurse. The wounded from the battle at the bridge were lying on mattresses in the school building. There wasn't enough bandaging material. There weren't enough medicines. There were no surgical instruments at all. Dr. Kate O'Donnell arrived on the 5th day of the ceasefire. She arrived on a passing truck from a decommissioned Western Union field hospital on the coast. Tall, red-headed, wearing men's pants and boots 2 sizes too big. Carrying a leather satchel containing 3 scalpels and a bottle of Irish whiskey. She entered the school building. She looked at the wounded. She looked at the old doctor. She looked at the conditions. And she cursed so fiercely that the old doctor turned pale and the nurse crossed herself. Then she took off her jacket, rolled up her sleeves, and she began to operate. 7 hours straight, without a break. Except for one when she went out onto the porch and smoked her pipe while standing in the rain. Daniel came to see her the next morning. She was sitting on the school steps smoking her pipe. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep. Her hands were covered in dried blood. He sat down next to her. She looked at him and said that if he'd come to give a speech about what a hero she was, he could go to hell right away. Daniel said he'd come with a proposal. He could build a hospital for her, a real one, with a sterile ward, with an X-ray machine, with penicillin. Kate stopped smoking. She looked at him for a long time. Then she asked if he was crazy. Daniel said maybe, but that didn't change the proposal. Building the hospital took the rest of the truce. The Duchess provided the building, an old merchant's house near the market square. 2 stories, stone walls, a solid foundation. Daniel took an X-ray machine out of a box. He spent a day in bed afterward. He took out surgical instruments after a day of weakness. He took out 20 vials of penicillin and detailed instructions on how to cultivate it. A night of fever. Kate looked at the penicillin, at the labels that shouldn't have existed, at the instructions printed in a font that didn't exist in any printing house in the world. She asked where it came from. Daniel said he'd explain later. Kate asked, later when exactly? Daniel replied, when you save your first 100 patients. Kate looked at him, then at the penicillin, then back at him and said, all right. On the hospital's opening day, Daniel came into her office. He placed a sheet of paper on the desk. On the sheet was a list of 140 names. Kate asked what it was. Daniel said these were the people she would save in this building during its first year of operation. He had calculated it based on statistics on injuries and illnesses and the capabilities of the equipment. 140 people who would have died without this hospital, but now wouldn't. Kate read the list, slowly, name by name. Her face remained expressionless, only her hands. Her hands were trembling. She placed the list on the table. She took out a bottle of whiskey. She poured 2 mugs. She pushed one toward Daniel. She raised hers and said she was drinking to the 140. Daniel didn't drink whiskey, but this time he did. The 3rd month. The truce with the Continental Pact was still holding, but tensions were rising. Drakensberg had withdrawn his troops 5 kilometers from the bridge. Formally, a gesture of goodwill. In reality, a regrouping. His supply units were laying a new field railway toward the border. Daniel knew what that meant. Heavy artillery. Drakensberg was preparing for the 2nd round. But this time, he wouldn't be sending infantry across the bridge. He would obliterate Halden's positions with artillery from 10 kilometers away and only then advance. Daniel stood over the map and calculated. He had maybe 2 months, maybe 3. That should be enough time to make Halden such a tough nut to crack that even heavy artillery wouldn't help. But to do that, he needed what he feared most of all. He had to open the box again and pull out the men. He'd been putting it off for 2 weeks, finding excuses, keeping himself busy with the factory, the hospital, the fortifications, training the soldiers. Every day was packed to the brim, but every evening, when he was alone in his office, he would take out the box and look at it. And he would think about those 8 tankers who were the first to appear in the hangar, about their faces, about their eyes, about how, somewhere in another world, their families had already received their death notices. Or maybe they hadn't. Maybe they'd simply vanished, disappeared, as if they'd never existed. Daniel don't know. And that was the worst part, not knowing. On the 15th day, he made up his mind. He didn't need tank crewmen. He needed engineers, mechanics, electricians, people who knew how to build and repair things. He sat down in the carriage house and closed his eyes. He thought of the repair platoon of the 1st Tank Division, 24 men, mechanics, welders, electricians. He'd built a diorama of that unit 3 years ago. He remembered the numbers and faces from the book. He opened the box. Light, pain, darkness. When he came to, there were 2 repair trucks in the shed, and 24 men in oil-stained overalls were looking at him. He was lying on the floor and couldn't move. His body was on fire. His ears were ringing. One of the mechanics bent over him, an older man, about 45, gray temples, calm eyes. He said something in Russian. There was no interpreter, but Daniel understood from the tone of his voice. He was asking if he needed help. Daniel tried to nod. The mechanic lifted him up like a child and sat him down on a crate. He gave him water from a canteen. Daniel drank and looked at these people. Another 24 lives. Another 24 families who had lost their fathers, husbands, and brothers. He finished the water and said in German that he was sorry. The mechanic didn't understand the words, but he seemed to understand something else. He put his hand on Daniel's shoulder and nodded. The repair platoon changed everything. These people were masters, real ones. They could fix anything out of anything. Daniel introduced them to Greta. The meeting was historic. Greta stood in the middle of her workshop with her hands covered in oil, looking at 24 men in unfamiliar uniforms. They were looking at her. An elderly mechanic named Semenov walked over to the lathe. He looked at it. He touched the spindle. He turned the handle. Then he turned to Greta, and in German, he said 2 words. Spindle play. Greta stared at him, then at the lathe, then back at him, and she said in perfect German that she'd known about spindle play for 3 years already, and if he could fix it, she'd be ready to marry him right then and there. Semyonov didn't understand half the sentence, but he caught the word fix. He nodded. He took off his jacket. He pulled out his tools, and 4 hours later, the machine was working like new. Greta stood nearby and watched. When he finished, she shook his hand, firmly, like a man, and she said, "Welcome." From that day on, the factory was truly up and running. The Russian mechanics and the Halden workers couldn't understand a word each other said, but they understood metal, tools, and blueprints. Cartridge production rose to 3,000 a day. They began manufacturing grenades, simple ones, defensive ones, based on Daniel's blueprints. They began repairing the damaged guns that had previously just been sitting in the arsenal courtyard. At the same time, Daniel began doing what he had been avoiding. He began getting to know the people he had rescued, not as units, but as individuals. Kovalev, 23 years old, from Saratov. His father was a teacher, his mother a doctor, his younger sister Nastya. Before the war, he studied at a technical college. He wanted to become an engineer. He was drafted in 1941. He fought for a year. He'd been in 3 tanks. 2 of them had burned up. Daniel sat with him one evening in the barracks and listened through an interpreter. Kovalev didn't say much, but when he did speak, every word was as heavy as a weight. He said he wasn't angry with Daniel. He said it was pointless to be angry. He said that war is war, and it doesn't matter which side you're on. What matters is who you stand for. Then he paused and asked one thing. He asked if Daniel remembered his real name. Daniel said, Alexei Mikhailovich Kovalev. Kovalev nodded. He said that as long as someone remembers his name, he is alive. Daniel remembered. Browner, 36, from Bremen, married, 2 children. His son Kurt is 7. His daughter Marta is 4. His wife is Irma. She worked at the post office. Browner spoke about them dryly and briefly, as if giving a report. But his eyes weren't dry. Daniel listened and jotted down notes in his notebook. Every name, every detail. He owed these people everything, and he began to repay them in the only way he knew how, with his attention. Toward the end of the 2nd month, something happened that changed Daniel forever. Sun-ri Cho, 17 years old, Korean on her mother's side, an orphan. She had come with a group of refugees from the Continental Pact, 12 people, women and children, hungry, frostbitten. They had crossed the border at night through a mountain pass. Sun-ri was among them, small, thin, short hair. With a notebook she clutched to her chest with both hands, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. She didn't speak. She hadn't uttered a word in 3 months. The women in the group said her village had been burned down by their own people, packed troops, because one of the villagers had been helping the partisans. Sun-ri had seen it. Daniel stood at the gate of the refugee reception center and looked at her. She stood apart from the others. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just stood there, staring straight ahead. Her eyes were empty. Daniel approached her. She didn't step back. She didn't look away. She just looked at him from the bottom up, expressionless. Daniel crouched down in front of her. He said hello in Korean. She blinked. For the first time in 3 months, someone had spoken to her in her mother tongue. She didn't answer, but she blinked. And that was the beginning. Daniel didn't try to get her to talk. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to comfort her. Silently, he took a pencil and a blank notebook out of his pocket. He held them out to her. She took them. He told her in Korean that she could write down everything she saw in his office. Everything. Every piece of paper, every conversation, every decision. In a year, they'd see which one of them had lied more often. She looked at him. 5 seconds. 10. Then she took the pencil and followed him. Sun-ri moved into a small room next to Daniel's office. She came every morning. She sat in the corner. She opened her notebook and she wrote everything down. Everything. Who came in, what they said, what orders Daniel gave, what decisions he made, what mistakes he made. She didn't speak, but she listened and took notes. She had a photographic memory. A week later, she could reproduce any conversation she'd heard word for word. After 2 weeks, she began to notice things that Daniel hadn't noticed. Once, she placed her notebook in front of him, open to the page where it said that Lieutenant Weber had left headquarters twice that day and gone to the telegraph station without orders. Daniel checked. Weber was sending personal telegrams to his mother in Weidenfeld. Nothing suspicious. But Sun-ri had noticed. A month later, she began to speak. Not much, 1 or 2 words a day. In Korean. Then in German. Short phrases. but every word was precise and meaningful. Daniel didn't rush her. He didn't express his joy out loud. He simply nodded and continued working, as if silence and speech were equally normal. Because for her, at that moment, they were equally difficult. By the end of the third month, Daniel looked around and, for the first time, saw not a plan, but people. Rauch, who came every week from Eldmark and brought letters from Marcus. The boy had recovered. He walked on crutches. He wrote long letters to his uncle, asking who this strange foreigner was who had saved his life. Von Eisenberg, who sat alone in headquarters in the evenings, rereading the casualty lists. 83 names. He knew each one. Anneliese, who spent 2 hours every day at the hospital. She read to the wounded. She wrote letters for those who couldn't write. She never once cried in front of them. She cried afterward, in her office, at night. Daniel knew because once he walked past her door at 3 in the morning and heard her. He stopped, stood there for a moment, and walked away. He didn't knock, because some things a person has to do alone. Hana, who came to see him every evening, and they would talk in Korean for an hour, about everything, about the news, about politics, about food, about the home neither of them had anymore. Emily, who kept sending coded messages to London, but every time looked at Daniel with an expression he couldn't read. Greta, who would come to Daniel's office after work with blueprints and tea, and they'd sit until midnight discussing launches and calibers and talking about things that were more important than the war. About bicycles, about kerosene lamps, about the future. Kate, who went out onto the hospital porch every morning and smoked her pipe and watched the sunrise and counted those she had saved. 7 in the first week, 12 in the second, 23 in the first month. Sunri, who sat in the corner taking notes and once, for the first time ever, smiled. Just a little, with one corner of her mouth. When Daniel tripped over the threshold and dropped a stack of papers, she smiled, and Daniel pretended not to notice, because if he'd said anything out loud, she would have stopped. The 6th month. Winter in Halden was harsh. The snow fell in November and didn't melt until March. Temperatures dropped to -20 in the mountains. The Schwarz River froze over. The bridge stood white and silent like a monument. The truce with the Continental Pact had been extended twice. Drakensberg hadn't attacked. But he hadn't left either. His army was stationed 15 kilometers from the border. The field railway had been completed. Heavy howitzers had arrived. Daniel knew that the second round would begin in the spring, and this round would be different. But winter had given him time, and he used every day of that winter as he had never used time in his past life. Greta's factory was running 3 shifts, 120 workers. 70 of them were women. 5,000 rounds a day. Grenades, mortar shells. Simple but reliable. Semenov and his mechanics got the foundry up and running. They started casting spare parts for tanks. Not all of them. Daniel still had to get the complex assemblies from the box, but they were already making the simple parts themselves. Road wheels, tracks, bolts, springs. Every part they made with their own hands was a small victory over their dependence on the box. Daniel understood that the box was a crutch. A strong one, a convenient one, but still a crutch. And if Halden wanted to survive, it had to learn to walk without it. At the same time, Daniel focused on something more important than tanks and ammunition: people. He set up classes for the locals: mechanics, electrical engineering, radio communications, medicine, and agriculture. Anyone who could teach did so. Semenov taught mechanics through an interpreter and sign language. Kate gave lectures on field surgery to the nurses. Browner trained local soldiers in motorized infantry tactics. Kovalev drilled the tank crews. Hana Seo taught a foreign language course for staff officers. Emily unexpectedly proved to be a brilliant instructor in radio interception. She taught Halden's radio operators to monitor the airwaves and extract useful information from the noise. Daniel asked her why she was helping. Emily said she was bored. Then she paused and said that her cipher messages were getting stranger and stranger. London was demanding details from her about the origin of Halden's technology, insistently, harshly. She said she was writing evasive replies for now, but her superior's patience wasn't infinite. Daniel nodded. He knew this conversation was coming. He took a sheet of paper out of a sheet of paper from his desk drawer. He placed it in front of her. It was a copy of her latest cipher, decrypted. Emily stared at the sheet, then at Daniel. Her face turned pale, then red. She asked how. Daniel said that Hana Seo was very skilled at deciphering ciphers. Emily clenched her teeth. Daniel raised his hand. He said he didn't want to catch her. He didn't want to threaten her. He didn't want to blackmail her. He wanted her to help him rewrite the next cipher so that London would get what it wanted and Halden would remain unharmed. Emily looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was either a genius or an idiot. Daniel said it was more likely the latter. Emily didn't smile, but she picked up a pencil and said she'd show him how to write ciphers that tell the truth, but not the whole truth. In January, what Daniel had been waiting for and fearing happened. The Western Union sent an official delegation, 3 diplomats, 2 military observers, and 1 man with no official title. Quiet, inconspicuous, a gray suit, a gray face, gray eyes. He introduced himself as Mr. Coleman, an advisor. Mr. Coleman stayed in Haldenberg for a week. He walked through the factory, through the barracks, through the hospital. He watched. He took notes. He asked questions that sounded harmless but were as sharp as a scalpel. Daniel showed him around himself. He showed him everything. Almost everything. He didn't show him the box. He showed him the tanks. Mr. Coleman stood in front of a T-34 and was silent for 3 minutes. Then he turned to Daniel and said that the Western Alliance was ready to offer Halden a mutual defense pact. Military aid, economic support, guarantees of sovereignty. In exchange for exclusive access to technologies that allow Halden to produce that no one else in the world possesses. Daniel listened. Then he said no. Mr. Coleman wasn't surprised. He said that this wasn't a final answer and that Daniel would think it over. Daniel said he'd already thought it over. Halden would not be an exclusive partner of any bloc. The moment Halden became part of one bloc, the other 2 would have a pretext for an attack. Neutrality is not a weakness. Neutrality is a strategy. Mr. Coleman looked at him impassively and said that neutrality is a luxury that only the strong can afford. Daniel said that was precisely why Halden was becoming strong. Mr. Coleman left, but 2 weeks later, Emily came to Daniel's place at night, without knocking. Her face was pale. She said she had intercepted a coded message from London, one not addressed to her, but to another agent, one she didn't know. The message contained an order. If Halden refused to sign the mutual, the Western Union would consider an option whereby Halden's technology would be obtained by other means. Emily hadn't deciphered the word other, but its meaning was obvious. Daniel sat at the table, staring at the encrypted message. Then he looked at Emily. She was standing by the door, her hands trembling. He asked why she had shown it to him. She could have kept quiet. She could have let it go. She could have stayed away. Emily said she didn't know. Then she said she did know. She said that for the first time in her life, she'd met someone she felt bad about betraying, and that she was angry at herself for it because it was unprofessional. Daniel stood up. He walked over to her, and for the first time since they'd met, he thanked her, not as an ally, but as a person. Emily turned away. She said that if he told anyone she'd almost cried, she'd break his nose. Daniel said he wouldn't tell. Spring of the first year, the snow had melted, the river had broken open, and along with it, the intentions of all three blocs were laid bare. The Continental Pact issued a new ultimatum, not directly to Halden, but to the Western Union and the Pacific Sphere. The text was simple. Halden is within the Pact's sphere of interest. Any interference in Halden's affairs will be considered an act of war. It was a declaration of rights. Drakenberg was no longer knocking. He was making demands. The Pacific Sphere responded a week later, with its own note, also about rights, also about interests, trade routes, strategic resources. For the first time in 20 years of war, the three blocs were not arguing directly with one another, but over a small principality in the mountains. Daniel read these notes and realized that this was both good and bad. Good because as long as they're arguing, they aren't firing shots. Bad because once they reach an agreement among themselves, Halden will become a bargaining chip. They'll hand it over to whoever offers the most, or they'll divide it into three parts, like a pie. Duchess Anneliese was reading the same notes. She was sitting at the desk in her office. In front of her was a photograph of her father. Behind her, on the wall, hung a map of Halden. She called for Daniel. He came in. She asked how much time they had. Daniel said that if the three blocs began negotiating among themselves, they'd have a month. If one of them decided to act alone, then a week. She nodded. Then she asked what he proposed. Daniel said one word: conference. The idea was simple and audacious. Halden invites all three blocs to a peace conference in Haldenberg, not on the Halden issue, on everything, on the entire war. 20 years of war, millions dead, economies in ruins, a generation of orphans. Halden offers itself as a neutral venue, a place where people can talk. When von Eisenberg heard this idea, he was silent for a minute. Then he said it was madness, that none of the blocs would send a delegation to a destitute principality with 12,000 bayonets, that it would be taken as an insult. Daniel said he knew, but that madness sometimes works precisely because no one expects it. The Duchess listened. Then she stood up and said she would sign the invitations. All three. Personally. Von Eisenberg opened his mouth to object. He looked at her and closed his mouth, because she was his duchess and she had made a decision. The invitations were sent out. The reply came 10 days later. All three blocs agreed. Daniel wasn't surprised. He knew why. Each of the three blocs wanted to see Halden from the inside. Each wanted to assess these mysterious technologies. Each hoped to win Halden over to their side, or at least to understand how a small principality managed to do things that no one else could. The conference was a pretext for intelligence gathering. Daniel knew this, and he intended to use it. The preparations took a month. Daniel worked around the clock. Hana Seo compiled dossiers on each delegate. She knew everything about them: habits, weaknesses, families, ambitions, fears. Through her channels, Emily obtained information about the Western Union's negotiating positions. Greta prepared a demonstration of factory production, not military, but civilian. Bicycles, kerosene lamps, hand pumps, plows. Kate organized a tour of the hospital. X-rays, penicillin, a sterile operating room, things that didn't exist in a single field hospital of any army in the world. The conference began in May. The delegates arrived. The Continental Pact sent General Drakenberg in person, accompanied by 2 diplomats and 4 officers. The Western Union sent Mr. Coleman, accompanied by 3 diplomats and 2 military officers. The Pacific Sphere sent Admiral Kuroda. Daniel hadn't met him before, but Hana turned pale when she saw his name on the list. She said that Kuroda wasn't a diplomat. He was the head of intelligence for the Pacific Sphere. He doesn't negotiate. He gathers information, and he uses it. Daniel nodded, another player at the table. The conference lasted a week. 7 days. 7 days of talks at the long table in the throne room of Haldenberg Castle. Duchess Anneliese presided, calmly, steadily, with a dignity that compelled generals and admirals to listen to a 22-year-old woman without interrupting. Daniel sat next to her. He didn't speak. He listened. He took notes. He passed her slips of paper with numbers whenever one of the delegates lied about their resources. On the 4th day of the conference, a turning point occurred. Drakenberg stood up and said he was ready to discuss a ceasefire across the entire Western Front. Not a truce, a ceasefire. The room fell silent. It was unthinkable. In 20 years of war, no one had ever uttered those words aloud. Coleman looked at Drakenberg as if he were crazy. Kuroda smiled, subtly, dangerously. The Duchess looked at Daniel. Daniel nodded slightly. She proposed a break until morning. Everyone agreed. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat in his office and thought. Drakenberg couldn't have made such a statement without approval from above. That meant someone in the Pact's leadership was tired of the war. That was good, but Kuroda was smiling, and that was bad. On the morning of the 5th day, an explosion woke Daniel. A bomb, in the castle's east wing, where the delegations were staying. Daniel ran out of his office. The hallway was filled with smoke and dust, screams, moans. He ran toward the site of the explosion. Half of the east wing had been destroyed. A wall had collapsed. Beams and stones jutted out from beneath the rubble. Von Eisenberg was already there with soldiers. They were clearing the debris. Kate arrived 5 minutes later with a medical bag. She began treating the wounded right on the spot. And the toll? 2 diplomats from the Continental Pact were killed. 1 officer from the Western Union was seriously wounded. Drakenberg is alive. Coleman is alive. Kuroda is alive. Uninjured, not a scratch. His room was at the other end of the wing. Hana came to see Daniel an hour later. Her face was ashen. She said the bomb had been planted by a man from the Pacific Sphere delegation, one of Kuroda's officers. She had seen him that night in the hallway near the east wing. She hadn't said anything earlier because she wasn't sure. Now she was certain. Daniel clenched his fists. Kuroda had derailed the conference, deliberately, because peace was not part of the Pacific Sphere's plans. War was their business, their means of expansion. Peace meant the end of expansion. The conference was cut short. The delegations left. Drakenberg left in silence. Coleman left with a stony expression. Kuroda left with that same faint smile. The Duchess stood at the castle gates and watched the last car drive away. Then she turned to Daniel. Her face was calm, but her hands were trembling. She said they would try again. Daniel said yes, they would try, as many times as it took. A year. A whole year. Daniel Park had lived in this world for 1 year. He sat in his study that evening, staring at the wall. On the wall hung a map of Halden, studded with pins. The red ones were threats. Blue meant resources. Green meant people. There were the most green ones. Over the course of that year, Halden had changed. It hadn't become stronger militarily. It had become something else. Greta's factory produced more than just ammunition. Bicycles were rolling out of the gates, 200 of them over the past 3 months. For the first time in their lives, the children of Haldenberg were riding bicycles along the cobblestone streets. Daniel saw this from his study window, and every time he would stop and watch. Kate's hospital was up and running. 114 lives saved in the first year. Daniel had miscalculated. Not 140, 114. 26 had died. Kate knew every name among those 26, and she drank to their memory every evening. But she drank less than before, because in the morning she needed steady hands. The school was up and running. Soon-Ri taught Korean and Russian children there to read in German. Where did the children come from? From the soldiers. Kovalev married the daughter of a baker from Halden, a quiet wedding. Daniel was the best man. The other two tankers had also found families. The Russian and German soldiers whom Daniel had pulled out of another world were taking root in this one. Slowly, painfully. But they were taking root because people know how to do that. To put down roots in any soil, as long as that soil isn't burning beneath their feet. But Daniel couldn't forget. Every night before bed, he'd take out his notebook and reread the names. 384 people. That's how many he'd saved in a year. 384 lives stolen from another world. Each one had a family. Each one had children, parents, friends, comrades. They had all vanished, missing in action. Daniel would close his notebook and lie in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking that no bicycles, hospitals, or schools could ever make up for what he had done. Never. He couldn't fix it. He couldn't bring them back. He couldn't even tell them the truth. Except for Soon-Ri. She knew. She found out by accident, in her 7th month. She had been reading the diary of an elderly sergeant from the repair platoon, Semyonov, the very same one who had repaired Greta's machine. Semyonov kept a diary every day in neat, small handwriting, and in one of the entries, he wrote that the last thing he remembered before Halden was the road near Kursk. July 1943. Heat, dust, a column of tanks ahead, and then a white light. And here he was, and that sometimes at night he hears the voices of his wife Masha and his daughter Lena and wakes up in a sweat. Soon-Ri read this. She closed the diary. She went to Daniel. She placed the diary on the table. And for the first time ever, she spoke a long sentence. She said in Korean that she knew now, and that she wouldn't tell anyone, but that he now had to live in a way that would make it all worthwhile. Daniel looked at her, at this little 17-year-old girl who had seen her village burned to the ground, who had remained silent for 3 months, who had every right not to trust a single adult in the world. And she didn't condemn him. She gave him a task. Live in a way that makes it all worthwhile. He nodded, because that was all he could do. The second year began with good news. Drakenberg had sent a personal letter, not to the Duchess, but to Daniel. He wrote that he had returned to the Pact's capital and had reported on the situation, that there were people in the Pact's leadership who were tired of the war. Not the majority, but enough to block a new offensive against Halden. He wrote that the assassination attempt on Kuroda had caused a scandal. The Pacific Sphere had recalled Kuroda, formally. Informally, he continued to operate, but his options were limited. Drakenberg wrote that if Halden proposed a new conference in 6 months, the Pact would send a delegation with real authority, not observers, negotiators. Daniel read the letter, and his hands trembled. Not out of fear, out of hope. Hope was more dangerous than fear, because disappointment followed in its wake. But he couldn't help but hope. He showed the letter to the Duchess. Anneliese read it. Then she looked up, and for the first time in a year, she smiled. Not fully, just the corners of her lips, but she smiled. Daniel remembered that moment, because before that, he'd seen her cry and seen her remain silent and seen her give orders and seen her endure. But he hadn't seen her smile. Daniel spent the entire second year building, not an army, a country. A second ammunition production line, not at Greta's factory, a separate one, in Weidenfeld. Local workers, local engineers, trained by Semyonov and his people. Daniel didn't take a single thing out of the box for this plant, not a single bolt. Everything was local. Everything was their own. It was slower, the quality was worse, but it was their own. A power plant, a small one, hydroelectric, on the Schwarz River. Daniel took a generator and a turbine out of the box. 2 days of feverish work followed. But when the electric streetlights on the main street in Haldenberg lit up for the first time, the Duchess stood at the window of her office and looked at the light. Daniel stood beside her. She said that light was beautiful. Then she turned to him and said thank you. Simply, without titles or formalities. Thank you. Daniel said, "You're welcome." And they stood there, looking at the light, in silence, side by side. And the distance between them, which had once been measured in titles, lineage, and centuries, was, at that moment, measured only by the width of the windowsill. By the end of the second year, Halden had changed beyond recognition. The population had grown. Refugees from all 3 blocks were streaming toward the small principality in the mountains. Because there was light here, literally and figuratively. There was a hospital here. There was a functioning factory here. There were schools here. There were children on bicycles here. There was no shooting here. Halden had become what Daniel wanted it to be. Not a fortress, a refuge. A place where one could live, not just survive. One evening, von Eisenberg stood with Daniel on the castle wall and looked down at the city below. Lights in the windows, smoke from the chimneys, laughter coming from the street. Children. The colonel was silent for a long time. Then he said that in 20 years of service, he had defended this country and thought that defense meant walls and cannons. But it turned out that defense meant the light in the windows. The beginning of the 3rd year, Daniel was preparing for the 2nd conference. This time, everything was different. Halden no longer asked. Halden made proposals. Daniel worked on the document for a month, alone, at night, by the light of an electric lamp in his office. Sunri sat in the corner and took notes. Sometimes he asked for her opinion. She answered briefly and precisely. Over the course of 2 years, she had become his right-hand woman, his memory, his conscience. She was 19. She spoke 4 languages. She remembered everything, every promise he had made, every name he had written down, every number he had mentioned, and she wouldn't let him forget. The document was called the Reconstruction Plan, not a defense plan, not a war plan, a plan for what would come next. A 5-year plan, 120 pages long, with numbers, tables, and graphs. Daniel had poured everything he knew into it. His entire life as a logistics engineer, all his calculations, all his models, supply routes, railroads, hospitals, schools, factories, power plants, agricultural programs, housing construction, everything needed for the world to survive after 20 years of war. Not Halden, the world, the whole world, all 3 blocks. He showed the plan to the Duchess. She read it for 2 days. Then she called for him. He came in. She was sitting at the table. The document lay before her. She was looking at him. Her eyes were strange. He couldn't read the expression. She said the plan was brilliant. Then she said it was unfeasible. Then she said it didn't matter. Because what matters isn't carrying out the plan, but showing that it's possible. Showing that someone sat down and did the math. That peace isn't an abstraction, but specific kilometers of railroad tracks and metric tons of cement and doses of vaccines. Daniel nodded. She understood. She always understood, faster than anyone else. Then she stood up. She walked over to the window. She stood there for a long time with her back to him. Then she said quietly that this plan had everything except one thing. Daniel asked what? She said, except for him. Except for what would happen to him when it was all over. Daniel was silent. She turned around. Her face was calm, but her eyes were wet. She said that over the past 2 years, He had built things for everyone around him, for the soldiers, for the refugees, for her, for the country. But he hadn't built anything for himself. Daniel said he was fine. She said he was lying, and that she'd learned to tell when he was lying, because when he lied, he didn't look her in the eyes. He looked at his hands. Daniel looked at his hands, and he couldn't help but smile. She was right. She sat back down. They were silent. Then she said that when the war ended and the plan was launched, she would like him to stay. Not as an advisor, not as an engineer, as someone by her side. Daniel looked at her, at this woman who was 24 years old and on whose shoulders rested an entire country, who didn't cry in front of others, who brought broth to the wounded every day and read letters for those who couldn't write, who had learned to make iced coffee because he once said at breakfast that he missed cold coffee. He said he would stay. She nodded, turned away toward the window, and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Quickly, out of habit, like someone who had long since learned to do it discreetly. The second conference was scheduled for June. A month before it, Daniel discovered something that changed everything. Anneliese called him down to the castle's basement, to the archives, an old, dusty room with stone vaults, shelves lined with books and scrolls. She'd found it by accident while going through her great-grandfather's papers. A diary, an old one, bound in leather, handwritten in the script of the late 19th century. She handed it to Daniel. He began to read, and the world around him came to a standstill. The Duchess's great-grandfather wrote about a strange guest from the East, a man with an accent, wearing unfamiliar clothes, who brought impossible machines. He stayed in Halden for 50 years. He built the first paved road, the first water supply system, the first hospital. Then he disappeared, quietly, at night, leaving a note in which he wrote that his time was up and that Halden could now stand on its own. Daniel closed the diary. He sat down on a dusty chest. His hands were shaking. He wasn't the first. Someone before him, with the same little box, with the same abilities, with the same pain. That man lived here for 50 years. He built, he created, he passed it on, and he left. And 100 years later, the world still slid into war. So it's not about machines, not about technology, not about tanks and generators and penicillin. It's about something else, something you can't get out of a box. He looked at Anneliese. She was standing next to him, looking at him, waiting. He said his task wasn't to build. His task was to pass it on, to teach, to make sure that the next time a crisis struck, Halden wouldn't need a strange visitor with a box. He'd need only his own people. Greta, Kate, Kovalev, Bronner, Semenov, Sunri, all of them. Anneliese nodded. She understood. As always, faster than he did himself. Daniel rewrote the plan. In 2 nights, he removed everything from it that depended on the box. He left only what Halden could do himself, with his own hands, with his own wits, with his own resources. The plan became more modest, more realistic, and more honest. Sunri read the new plan. She looked at Daniel, and for the first time in 2 years, she smiled fully, with both corners of her mouth. Daniel said it wasn't fair, because when she smiled, he wanted to rewrite all his plans from scratch. Sunri said that was exactly why she was smiling. The second conference began in June of the 3rd year. The throne room of Haldenberg Castle, that same long table, those same stone walls, those same worn banners. But the light was different, electric. The first light bulbs in this hall. The delegations had arrived. The Continental Pact, General Drakenberg. Next to him, two men in plain clothes, civilians. For the first time in 20 years, the pact had sent not only military personnel to the negotiations. The Western Union, Mr. Coleman. Next to him, an elderly man with a ribbon of honor, a former prime minister, retired, but still influential. The Pacific Sphere, not Kuroda, another man, Ambassador Tanaka, a career diplomat, gray-haired, quiet, with eyes that had seen too much. Hana stood behind him as an interpreter, officially. Unofficially, she was Daniel's eyes and ears at that table. Duchess Anneliese opened the conference, briefly, without flowery words. She said that Halden had invited everyone, not because he considered himself entitled to decide the fate of the world, but because someone had to sit down and do the math. Then she turned to Daniel and said that Advisor Park had the floor. Daniel stood up. He had never given a public speech in his life. He didn't know how. He didn't want to. He was afraid. He stood before the generals, diplomats, and ambassadors in his ill-fitting suit, his hands slightly stained with machine oil because that morning he'd helped Greta fix the press. He began to speak, in German, in simple terms, warmly, thoroughly. He didn't speak like a politician, not like a general, not like a diplomat. He spoke like an engineer who does the math. He said that the war had been going on for 20 years, that 17 million people had died during that time, that the economies of all three blocs were working for the war, not for the people, that children were being born and growing up without knowing what peace was, that widows were growing old alone, that orphans become soldiers, and father knew orphans. He said he had done the math. He always does the math. He presented the figures, the cost of a single day of war for each bloc, the cost of a single year, the cost of 20 years. The figures were terrifying, not because they were large, but because there were names behind each one. He didn't mention any names, but everyone in the room knew. Then he placed a document on the table, 120 pages, a 5-year reconstruction plan. He said that this plan wasn't perfect, that he made mistakes, that the calculations might be inaccurate, but that this was the first time anyone had sat down and calculated how much peace costs. Not how much war costs, how much peace costs. And that peace costs less. Much less. He said that Halden had proven it. A small, impoverished principality had built more in 2 years than 3 empires had in 20. Because it built for the people, not against them. He fell silent. He sat down. His hands were trembling under the table. Anneliese, sitting next to him, lightly touched his hand with hers. For a second. That was enough. The room was silent. Drakhenberg looked at the document. Coleman looked at Daniel. Tanaka looked out the window. Then Drakhenberg stood up. He picked up the document. He opened it. He read the first page, the second, the third. He closed it. He looked at Daniel and said he wanted to discuss the section on railroads in detail because his engineers had been proposing a similar route for a year, but without financial projections. Coleman cleared his throat and said that the Western Union was interested in the section on medical care, especially the part about penicillin. His government was ready to discuss joint production. Tanaka spoke quietly. He said that the Pacific Sphere was ready to discuss opening trade routes, provided there were guarantees. The negotiations began, real ones, not for show, without smiles or empty promises. Tough, long, contentious. 14 hours a day for 3 days. Daniel sat at the table and kept track. He answered questions, he showed charts, he explained the numbers. Next to him was Sun-Ri with a notepad. She wrote down every word, every promise, every caveat, so that later no one could say they hadn't said it. Hana translated for Tanaka while simultaneously watching every gesture made by each delegate. Emily stood by the wall and listened. Her last encrypted message to London had been blank. She'd sent a blank page. It was her letter of resignation. On the fourth day, Drakenberg proposed a formulation. A ceasefire on all fronts, indefinite, with the establishment of a joint demarcation commission. Coleman was silent for a long time. Then he said that his government had authorized him to sign a preliminary agreement. Tanaka said that the Pacific Sphere would sign on the condition that trade issues be included in the commission's mandate. Duchess Anneliese sat at the head of the table. Her face was calm. Her hands did not tremble. She had grown over these 2 years. Not in years. Something else. She said that Halden was ready to serve as the commission's headquarters, a permanent one, and as neutral territory for any negotiations between the blocs. All 3 delegations agreed, not immediately, but after 2 more hours of debate over the wording. But they agreed. On the evening of the 4th day, the document was signed. 3 signatures, 3 seals. On the table in the throne room of Haldenberg Castle, von Eisenberg stood against the wall and watched. His one eye glistened. He wasn't crying. He didn't know how to cry. But his eye was shining. Rauch stood beside him, the old captain, from day one, from that truck in the rain. He looked at Daniel, and his face was the kind of face a man has when he believed when no one else did, and turned out to be right. After the signing, Daniel left the hall. He walked across the courtyard, through the gate, down the street, past houses with electric lights in the windows, past the hospital from which Kate had come out and waved her phone at him, past Greta's factory, from which the sound of hammers could be heard, the evening shift. He walked and walked, across the bridge over the Schwarz River, across the old Schwarzbrück Bridge, that very one. The shell craters had been filled with fresh stone. The railings had been restored. But if you looked closely, you could see dark spots on the parapets. He reached the middle of the bridge. He stopped, sat down on the parapet, took out a small box, a green one, worn. He opened it. Empty, as always. He looked at the water below. The river flowed and glistened in the sunset. Footsteps behind him. He didn't turn around. He knew who it was. Anneliese sat down next to him, without her entourage, in a simple travel coat, holding 2 mugs. Coffee. With ice. She'd learned. She held out a mug to him. He took it. They sat in silence. The river roared. The wind was warm. June. 2 years ago, tanks had been burning and bodies had lain here. And now the 2 of them were sitting on the railing, drinking cold coffee. Anneliese said she didn't know who he was or where he was from. She said she wouldn't ask anymore, because it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was here. What mattered was that he'd stayed. Daniel looked at the river. Then he looked at the little box in his hand. Then at her. And he closed the box, put it in his pocket, and said he had one more plan. She asked what it was. He said he wanted to build a bench on this bridge, so people could sit and drink coffee without having to lean on the railing. Anneliese looked at him and laughed, quietly, briefly, for the first time in his presence. Real laughter, not a smile, laughter. Daniel thought that for the sake of that sound, it was worth crossing worlds. People were walking across the bridge, workers from the evening shift, a woman with a child in her arms, an old man with a dog, 2 soldiers. One spoke Russian, the other spoke German. They were laughing at something, not understanding each other's words, but understanding the laughter. Daniel watched them, the bridge, the city on the hill behind him, the lights in the windows, and for the first time, he thought that maybe this was the answer. Not tanks, not guns, not a little box, but this. the bridge, with people walking across it, not into battle, home. He finished his coffee, cold, bitter, with ice, the best coffee of his life. Then he looked at Anneliese. He said he'd promised her once that they wouldn't burn the next bridge. She nodded. He said he'd kept his promise. She said she knew. They were sitting on the railing of the Schwarzbrück Bridge. Sunset, the river, a warm breeze, lights in the city windows, and silence. Not the empty silence of war, the living silence of peace. Daniel placed his hand next to hers on the stone railing, without touching it, almost, and that was enough. In his pocket lay an empty tin box that had once held mint candies. It was no longer needed, because Daniel had already taken everything he needed from it, and these people would build the rest themselves.